Bad Ash Publishing presents Vengeance, Mage Hunter, Book 1. Written by Mel Todd. Narrated by Philip Polite. Featuring Autumn Juliet as the female cast in the prologue and epilogue. Dedication. To Garrett and Billy, thank you for being superfans. You've made my life better with your presence. Prologue. Archmage Scott Randolph, retired Mage Hunter, leaned back in the lawn chair, watching the people around him. How in the world had he managed to end up with this group of amazing people? He was almost 70, and yet, this group of people treated him the same as they did anyone else, even though he had at least 20 years on the humans. Mages, for the most part, had normal lifespans, though they died due to external causes more frequently. Those with familiars, while they aged, they often lived a longer and healthier life. Corisande Monroe he'd met almost 20 years ago when she was under 21. Now, she was in her early 40s, and the entire world knew who she was. When he'd met the scrap of a girl, who everyone thought was normal, he'd not thought much about her. Much more interested in dealing with idiot bikers and the cops. But somehow, over the years, he'd been pulled into her circle. That insane circle consisted of her partners, Joe and Sable, their kids, Jazz and Maine, plus their parents and siblings, and the other mages and realm denizens she connected with over the years.
Merlin, in this group, I'm the least powerful.
The thought made him smile, until his eyes landed on Corey again. Her face was the only adult one, missing a tattoo on her right temple. Her face still appeared wrong somehow. It was as if she was missing her nose. But then, she'd given up her magic to merge all the realms together, and make every person on Earth a mage. Of the people there, only the twins, Jazz and Maine, didn't have tattoos, but they were only 8 and hadn't emerged. When you emerged, you were tested and then got tattoos based on your magic, but that didn't happen until after puberty, normally. Sloane and Shay had not made this dinner. It had become a habit of Corey and her family to hold a barbecue or dinner every quarter and invite everyone in their circle of friends, both human and non. This time, Bainjarl, her griffin friend, and Esmir, her familiar's mother, had left a short while ago. Even after a year, the loss of Tyrsane, the Gorgon Lord of Spirit, was still a gaping wound for everyone. Marisol, Joe's mother, and Chris, Corey's brother, were keeping the twins occupied with their Quetzos, the mini dragons that were the kids' familiars. Sit Lally, a mage from the AIN, was in a Shea lounge deck chair with her familiar Kisis, a huge silver blue fox, curled up at her feet. Somehow, he'd been pulled into this family, and it was as if he had found home.
There are worse things in life than to have this as your family.
The thought bounced around his head. He should drag his niece Megan here sometime. She would enjoy this group of people. Though Megan would forever be annoyed there was no familiar for her after meeting the others. Megan was now in her 50s with her own family. But still, it was a thought. He didn't see her often enough as it was, and he wasn't getting any younger.
I swear time is flying faster than I realize, and I don't feel as old as I am. Is that good or bad?
He sipped on his beer, letting the conversation and sensation of being safe wash over him, when Corey's words broke into his musings.
Scott, how did you become a mage hunter? I mean, the first time I saw you, you were riding herd on Bam.
Corey settled back into her chair, watching him. Bam was the motorcycle gang Scott had been nominally in charge of back when they first met. It stood for badass mages, but mostly it had been mages that wanted a chance to cut loose, but not get in too much trouble. He had been one of them a long time ago. Half the people gathered at the barbecue at Corey's house stopped to focus on him. Scott groaned and rubbed his temple.
Oh, you love to ask the hard questions, don't you, Corey?
She flashed a smile at him.
It's amazing what you can learn by asking questions,
she said, as she rubbed Carillion's ears. The huge ruby red calf, a creature from the magical realms that resembled a huge red cat, leaned into the caress, eyes closing in pleasure.
Besides, we've all seen the movie. You're a hero.
He laughed.
Trust me, you're much more of a hero than I ever was.
Corey blushed and waved her hand.
I don't have a movie about me. Yet.
Joe teased. She dropped a kiss on Corey's head, then went to curl up with Sable.
You know, they have finished casting your role, And various air mages have been competing to try to create a viable illusion of Garlean when mixed with animatronics. Shush, you. I want his story. Mine is well known at this point.
To his amusement, she squirmed as she focused the attention back on him.
Please, I'd like to hear the real story.
Scott wrapped his hand around his beer bottle, thinking back to that first year of being a hunter, of the fear and elation and grief that year had brought, but also friendships and a job he'd realized he was good at.
You sure you want to hear this? It's complicated and not a short story. Besides, it happened, wow, over 40 years ago.
He glanced up to see the others settling down around them, the anticipation of a story on their faces. All the familiars were leaning in as well. They loved stories of any kind, but the ones involving their people were their favorites.
I mean, I guess I can. Just remember, the movie blended two sections of my life, and they exaggerated it a lot.
Jazz stared at him with wide eyes.
Yes, you lost your familiar,
She said with a hitch in her voice as she pulled her Quetzal Azul closer to her. Scott laughed with a frustrated sigh and petted Dolly, who gazed up at him. Her canine eyes creased with worry. Dolly die? Corey and Joe both gave sad smiles. Though common wisdom had it that familiars only spoke to their mages, Carillion apparently corrupted all the familiars he came in contact with, as most of these familiars spoke to everyone. Even the Quetzals were rather chatty. Only a small percentage of mages had familiars, and while they were never earth creatures, they usually resembled them. Though how you were chosen still remained a mystery that none of the familiars would or could explain. He was still surprised Dolly chose to stay with him after her mage died due to complications of diabetes. As far as he knew, no one else had ever had a familiar transfer to them, and he had received all the gifts that came with one, though the greatest gift of all was her very presence.
No, you aren't dying, girl.
He rubbed her ears, and she leaned in, eyes closed and tail thumping hard.
That's another example of the news and movies not getting it right. There had been a stuffed animal at the mall, and the reporters were convinced I had a familiar.
He sighed again at all the memories bubbling to the surface.
You sure you want to hear this? It's a messy story.
Joe settled down in the love seat next to Corey. Sable curled up with her a moment later as they watched Scott.
Oh, I'm sure.
Sable said.
But I loved that movie as a kid. I must have watched it a dozen times. You were such the hero.
Scott groaned.
I should have never signed that waiver. Trust me, I'm not the action hero you think.
Corey snorted.
Yes, you are. I watched you cow those idiot bikers.
That was my job,
He protested.
Besides, they were drunk idiots.
Yep, and I firmly believe you were a hero as well.
Corey smirked at him with zero sympathy. Her hair fell to her shoulders, and she sighed with contentment, wiggling her toes under Carillion as he moved to sprawl at her feet.
Fine. Just don't hate me when you hear all the sordid details.
He settled back, one hand petting Dolly, and the other around his beer bottle, as he tried to think about how it all began.
Okay. This all started after I completed my degree, and I was working at a lab as my draft assignment. I was about 23, I think.
Chapter 1. Visit to the Mall. Archmage Scott Randolph pulled his face away from the electron microscope and stretched his arms up over his head, moving his long dark blonde braid off his shoulder to flop down his back. While playing with circuitry and accelerating time was fascinating, it did nothing for his physical well-being. Human bodies were not meant to be hunched over a microscope for hours on end. The stiffness in his body meant he needed to get up and move. His stomach rumbled as the clock flipped to 12 p.m. Noon. Time for some lunch. With one more stretch and a rub at his tired, light blue eyes, Scott headed out the door, hanging up his lab coat on the hanger, then badged out of the lab. The unit secretary sat at her desk, outside the secure doors. Headed out to lunch, Carla. Want me to grab you anything? He asked, as he gave her a quick smile. Carla was a good-natured woman, with dark brown skin and hair usually kept in twists. Her tattoo highlighted her status as a pattern mage, gleaming in yellows and oranges, and she'd made that into her color scheme. Whichever branch you were strongest in was the type of mage you were. Granted, she looked gorgeous in the colors, so it all worked. She was also an excellent secretary. He'd probably miss her when his draft service was done. Only 3 years and 5 months left to go. This job paid the standard wage, but it lacked excitement, and he had zero passion for quality testing. "Where you headed for lunch?" Carla asked, pulling her attention away from spreadsheets that, if he had to guess, were about the failure rates of the units he was testing. Time scoping on those was a quick way to test and see if they would fail with repeated use. He ran his finger over his temple as he pretended to think. The tattoo on his temple proclaimed him a time mage, for whatever good that did. Time mages weren't super useful, even if he did have water and entropy as well. Fire mages were the most useful and most in demand. He let his hand drop. He'd been lucky to be pulled by a lab, but then his master's in electrical engineering, with a minor in time, had helped with that. There were 3 classes of magic: chaos, order, and spirit. Spirit was the rarest of them, and given that the magic branches in that class involved telepathy or truth-telling, he was rather glad he wasn't a spirit mage. "Given the overwhelming number of choices, the mall food court," he replied with a smile. Their labs were across the street from the mall, and other than a McDonald's, the mall was the only option. Fine. Grab me a sandwich. You know, the rat place I prefer." She scribbled down what she wanted on a sticky note and handed it with the 20 to him. "Will do. Be back in a bit. I need to do some shopping too." While he would get back before the lunch hour was over, he needed to grab a gift for his niece's upcoming birthday. Megan would be turning 9, going on 21. "No hurry. I have more results to enter," she said with a smile, before turning back to her computer. Pattern mages, even if they were hedge mages, the lowest ranking you could get, were always in demand for analytical work. Mages were broken out by power levels. Hedge mages weren't required to get tattoos, or were subject to the draft. Most of the time, their magic wasn't enough to make them a risk. Then you had magicians, wizards, archmages, and merlins. Merlins were the only mages that could use magic in more than one class. He shoved the money in his pocket and headed out. The weather in Thousand Oaks, in Southern California, was gorgeous, as usual, encouraging him to walk over to the small, one-story mall. The 10-minute walk let him bask in the sun and helped chase away any lingering stiffness. He entered the mall near the food court and let the smells wash around him. What did he want? The smells tempted him in multiple ways, but first, he needed to get a present. His 8-year-old niece Megan, almost 9, had been hinting for a dog for the last year, but his sister, Emily, was horribly allergic to dogs and cats, making a pet a no-go. A store with huge stuffed animals in the window caught his attention. "Ah, that might work." He pivoted and walked in. 5 minutes later, he was walking out with a life-size, overly realistic husky in his arms. Getting this back with the lunches might be a challenge. Scott laughed to himself as he headed over to grab food, out of his whole 4 choices. First, Carla's sandwich, and while he stood there, he decided the wraps would solve his hunger problems. He'd placed the order after waiting at least 15 minutes to get to the counter. It was mid-August, and the mall was full of kids and families going back to school shopping. He sat at a table to wait, the dog sitting across from him, when the first scream rang out. A ripple of silence went through the people in the mall as everyone tried to figure out who screamed and why. Scott scanned the area, his nerves on edge. That scream had not been a kid or someone startled. That had been pure panic. "Attention mall goers," a voice came out over the mall speaker system. "This example of capitalistic excess has been seized by the Mage Rightful Rulers Group. We have locked all the doors, and you will sit down where you are. Do not think about fighting back. We have zero compunctions about killing sheep. All signals in and out of this building have been blocked. You belong to us." Scott had a hard time believing what he heard. Mage Rightful Rulers Group? What type of bullshit is this? He sat scoping out the area. Movement on either side of the food court caught his attention. The food court sat in the middle of the small mall, with 2 main entrances on either side, with the Anchor department store directly across from the food court. People in long robes with hoods were herding people forward. He counted 6 total people, 3 on each side. The robes were dark brown and revealed little about the people wearing them. What had everyone's attention were the balls of fire or ice that rotated in their hands. That answers one question. He flinched when someone stood up and yelled across the food court. "Fuck you! This is illegal! You hurt someone and it's the death penalty. We all know this. Get out of here. It was a man in jeans and a t-shirt, a tattoo on his temple catching the light. Before the words quit ringing and people were muttering their agreement, one of the mages lashed a fireball at him. Fire hit the man, spreading over his body like a living blanket of death. His screams as he burned alive had people falling to the floor, hands over their heads crying. The smell of burned flesh served as an underscore of the consequences of disobeying. Oh, fuck! Scott didn't move. He watched, partially frozen out of fear and partially out of anger.
I hope that removes the idea that we care about the government and their petty laws made to keep their rightful masters down. We are above their rules. Learn this now, or there will be more dead.
In counterpoint to the words coming out of the speakers, one of the mages hit a supporting pillar with a stream of water. The water streaked up, then into the structure, and the pillar shattered in a shuddering sound. The shrapnel exploded outward, slicing into more people. By now, most of the hostages were weeping and crying, while parents hovered over their kids. The area the pillar supported was over the bulk of the food court. A trickle of blood trailed down Scott's cheek where a piece of stone sliced him. But he ignored all that. He needed to see all of them. There had to be at least one in the security office, if that was where the audio system was located. He pummeled his mind for anything he knew about malls, but it wasn't much. Growing up, he'd been an active kid in the country. Malls were something you went to maybe twice a year, usually for school prep. In college, they held no attraction, so the last few months working at his draft job had been his only real interaction with them. You've got a master's degree. Use your brain. The mall had to have an office. That meant there were probably cameras. He flicked his gaze up and around. He never thought about it before, but there, little black domes recording everything. Still not moving his body, he sat still in the chair with the stuffed dog across from him. He let his eyes roam, watching the shrouded figures. One of them was nodding his head. Even though if they had been talking to each other, they were close enough he should have heard something. Okay, they're probably communicating via the phones. They've got eyes on us, restricting action. What can I do? The odds were 911 had already been called, but even if they hadn't, he had zero idea what they could do without someone on the inside. Scott surveyed the hostages again, hoping for a cop or a firefighter that had stopped in for lunch. It wasn't an expansive area, and he couldn't see anyone with a uniform. More movement, and at least 5 others came in, herding people from the shops into the center area.
All adults that are standing, I want you on your knees. All the kids, move out into the center area. Now!
The people herded in from the shops fled into the mix as parents protested having their kids pulled away from them. A mage, the cloak not hiding that this person was massive, strode over and grabbed an older kid. He backhanded the man that was trying to hold on to him into the counter. The gong that rang out as the man's head impacted the cheap stainless steel counters had Scott wincing in sympathy. He slumped to the ground, mumbling.
Get the children out here! Now!
The man roared, the hood falling back enough to reveal a thick, bushy beard. Weeping, kids moved to the center, forming a huddle. The overhead system spoke again.
Now that that is done, I want you to understand something. If you annoy us, we will kill a kid. If the cops that are even now surrounding this place annoy us, we will kill a kid. If I get frustrated, we will kill a kid. If you're smart, you'd better hope your elected officials do exactly what we ask. Or...
The speaker trailed off. The water mage turned and shattered 2 more columns, leaving only one supporting the roof above them. The speaker crackled again.
Not only will we kill your kids, we'll pull the building down on top of you.
Chapter 2. Fighting Back. They're insane. The thought filtered through his mind, but he didn't move. One person was dead. The kids were vulnerable, and he had no idea how many others waited in the wings. Right now, terror controlled everyone. The parents were frantic. The kids were crying, huddled together. If you take down one, the rest would follow through. I'm not spirit, so I can't KO people. KO was one of the useful skills in an otherwise useless class. Being able to knock everyone out would have solved the situation immediately. Too bad he wasn't spirit. As a time archmage, he had water, time, and entropy to use. He'd never taken more than the required biology courses, so he only knew the basics about human physiology. You sit and wait. It's all you can do. At some point, they moved everyone to the floor. They all sat facing the terrified kids, who were looking at them. The biggest blessing Scott had seen so far was all the kids were school age, which meant no infants, though the littler ones, 5 maybe, were bawling their heads off no matter how much the older kids tried to comfort them. It had been almost 3 hours, and with the music in the mall off, his mind magnified every sound. Scott kept going through options, trying to figure out how to help, but none of his ideas were viable, and they still had all the adults under the creaking roof, while the mages and the kids stayed out of the immediate impact area. Now there's an idea. Scott checked out the columns holding up the roof while pretending to wipe at his eyes. While his degree was in electrical engineering, he'd taken enough mechanical and construction to have a good sense of how this worked. He inspected the pillars and calculated where they would fall. No matter what happened with the hostages, the damage to the mall structure ensured a complete rebuild. At this point, he wouldn't worry about causing extra damage. He set a time bubble up on the worst part of the shattered pillar, the one farthest from them. Closing his eyes, he concentrated and added decay to it. Then he accelerated time. This bubble was small, only a foot across, and he offered as much as he could without it being noticed to ensure time raced. Not hours or months like he did in testing, but decades. You had to offer genetic material to get magic to work, and magic always told you the cost. This let mages decide if they wanted to spend that much offering. Hair and nails were the easiest to use, but not the only one. There were stories of people sacrificing fingers or toes to accomplish what they needed to. This wasn't that much magic. Scott wanted nothing to give away that he was using magic, so he used the lining on the inside of his mouth. It was more than enough for what he was trying to do. He sat with the others in the food court, scared teenagers, terrified parents, fuming shoppers, and no one possessed a Spirit Merlin tattoo. That would have been too easy. The sirens in the background had faded, and he glanced down to see how long they'd been there. 4 hours had passed. From his perspective, years had passed since this started. The man who'd resisted having his kid pulled away was conscious, but the rage and fear in his eyes worried Scott. If he did something stupid, he'd put all of them at risk. The 11 hooded mages moved back and forth, making it hard to keep track, as they were all in robes. Scott figured out the big one with the bushy beard was second in command, as he leaned over to talk to someone, and then told the others what to do. He named him Jughead in his mind. It made keeping them straight easier if they had names. The sound of a door slamming echoed in the silence, and everyone jerked up, their heads snapping toward the sound. A minute later, a tall man came striding out from one of the hallways. He was wearing a robe also, but his hood was down, and the symbols for an entropy Merlin blazed out on his right temple.
Boss man, who's a Merlin? This day just keeps getting worse.
The man stopped to have a muttered conversation with Jughead, and from their expressions, he got the impression the boss was pissed. Some of the other terrorists were close enough that they could overhear the conversation, and from their reactions, it wasn't what they wanted to hear.
Listen up. The police, in their infinite wisdom, aren't listening to our demands, so we're going to prove to them we're serious.
He was talking to the other mages, not the hostages. Scott focused on him, and his words with an idle wish for being an air mage. It would make it easier to overhear them.
Grab 3 kids and drag them outside. Let them go. I'll take care of it from there.
The parents in the group sagged with relief, and he saw more than one pair of crossed fingers. Scott knew deep down that the kids wouldn't be let go the way everyone hoped.
Marks, you sure?
Jughead asked, his tone carrying discomfort in it. The question from the second in command solidified it. He wouldn't have been uncomfortable setting kids free.
Were my words unclear? Boss man snapped back. Get going.
In the action movies, they always portrayed responses as if the hostages had coordinated their actions, or that the hero knew exactly what to do. Scott had no idea what to do, but he knew deep down, if they dragged the kids out of here, those children were all dead.
Please let this be the right thing to do.
The silent wish was all he had time for. Jughead shrugged, then turned toward the kids with 2 others, the kids shrinking back into a tight circle, their tears and yells starting back up. One older boy darted out, heading toward the adults, just as Scott slammed a stasis time bubble up over the kids, ignoring the cost. Normally, his time bubbles were a few millimeters, or, at most, centimeters across, not yards. But it set the kids out of time, and they would be safe until he pulled them back in. Time magic allowed for 3 types of time bubbles: stasis or stop, slow or speed up. but all of them were relative to your current time. The one on the column he'd sped up, and when he pulled it, all that age would snap in on the materials, and along with the decay, make them incredibly unstable. The one over the kids was a stop bubble. They would be locked in there until he lifted it, at which point they'd age the amount of time they'd been out of normal flow. Hopefully no more than an hour or two. Fuck. One kid is outside. I'll deal later. Scott surged to his feet, glad he kept in shape. Ellipticals and CrossFit weren't sexy or full of risk, but it meant that he could move when he wasn't hunched over a microscope. Run! He roared, and removed the time bubble on the support. Everyone turned to stare at him, and the robed idiots lifted their hands to throw magic. One of the advantages of working over a microscope is you were trained out of using gestures to cast magic quickly. The chance of hitting a knob or moving the samples ran too high. Without a thought, Scott sucked the moisture out of the first mage's eyeballs. The screaming grabbed everyone's attention, and they weren't moving. What part of run did they miss? Scott grabbed the hand of one of the women, tugging her up and to her feet. Run! Get away from the ceiling! He yelled. The creaking from the column he double-sabotaged was louder than the screaming from the mage. Kill him, snarled the boss man, but Scott was moving, and finally, so were the rest of the adults. He could do 2 small bubbles at the same time. He used that ability a lot at work, but an enormous bubble with people raging at him created stress he'd never dealt with before. He struggled to keep the kids out of time as he avoided the idiots trying to kill him. With the adults up and running, the pandemonium as the building started to fall, with fire and ice balls being cast, and kids huddled in a group with a bubble over them, made for a surreal scene Scott knew he'd never forget. But he didn't have time to pay attention. As more of the robed idiots swiveled toward him, he evaporated 2 more sets of eyeballs. Evaporation was a simple task. He used it to make sure the circuits were dry regularly. The hardest part was focusing on the person and the eyeballs. He didn't know what else to go after to make sure they were incapacitated. 12 terrorists. 3 are down. A crack made everyone duck as the ceiling came down, and as he thought, or hoped, it pulled down the tiles directly above the robed group. Not all the hostages had moved out of the way fast enough, though, and he saw legs and body parts covered with debris. But to his relief, the limbs were moving. I'll never be able to sleep again if my actions killed any of the hostages. The air filled with dust and people coughing. He heard something else breaking in the distance. He dismissed it as he focused on trying not to die. A bellow of rage grabbed his attention as he ran through the dust. The leader had thrown something at him. He felt magic hit him, and his magic instantly recognized decay. He countered the decay attack, glad for some of the theoretical tests he'd done at school. While he wasn't strong in entropy, he could use it to distract. He stopped for a moment to focus, and he sensed the remaining 9 people bringing their attention to him. Before they could react and attack him, Scott threw disease at all their mouths, then dove behind a pillar. Fire and ice hit the pillar, and he didn't have anywhere else to go. To his delight, he heard gagging and choking. Scott dropped to his butt and leaned out to see what the situation was. The 9 people had thrown back their hoods, gagging and throwing up as they tried to clear out their mouths from the stuff growing in it. A fireball soared past where his head would have been if he'd been standing. It took but a second to find the caster, Jughead. The man ignored the green slime oozing from his mouth, had his hand up, and looked ready to cast at Scott again. Without fretting over it, he had made the hard decisions during the long wait to get to this point. Scott sucked the moisture out of the man's brain. If the man could ignore what was coming out of his mouth, his eyeballs might not stop him. Jughead's mouth gaped open, exposing bacteria and fungus that grew so fast it was moving as Jughead collapsed to the floor, dead. I hope when the authorities kill me, they're kind about it. You've ruined everything, the boss hissed, and Scott whirled to see the man was standing behind him. Shit! Scott dove away, even as he tried to hit the man with an evaporation in his eyes, but he missed as he landed with a thud on his shoulder, jarring his concentration. Die! The man barked out. At the same time, a shot rang out, loud and sharp, among the groans and screams of people. Something warm and wet splattered over Scott. The boss crumpled to the ground, gasping twice, his whole body twitching. Then he lay still. Scott looked down to see blood and other viscera splattered all over him. He lifted his gaze back up to see a person in all black approaching, a rifle in their hand, scanning back and forth. Scott rolled over and put his hands behind his head and closed his eyes before they even said the words. Everyone down on the floor, hands behind your head. Anyone that moves will be shot. Chapter 3. Questioning. Scott sat immobile as cops and EMTs swarmed over the scene. He was handcuffed, and one of the people in all black was standing right next to him. He'd been told, "Any magic, you're dead, so don't." If this was the rogue Mage Hunters group, he would be dead. Their charter empowered them to execute on sight, and he'd broken the law multiple times tonight. He looked around at the damage that technically he'd caused and cringed. The paws of the stuffed dog peeked out from rubble, and he bit back a sigh. Now I need another birthday present, if I live that long. EMTs wheeled multiple people out on gurneys, and those that could stumble out unassisted were surrounded by cops. The remaining mall-goers were all talking fast, waving hands, and pointing at him. The kids were still sitting in the time bubble, watching everything, but he didn't want to bring it down until they told him. He had no idea what would happen if someone killed him while the time bubble was up. Had there been research on that? His mind went down rabbit holes of what if, while deputies carted the road mages off, many of them sobbing with shriveled raisins where their eyes had been. He winced at that, but he needed to distract them completely, and he used the dehydrate version of water often. It was so familiar it took almost no focus to cast it, just a whispered thought. Overall, he'd offered up about 3 inches of hair and a few nails to the quick to magic. They were the easiest offerings, though you could do things as simple as your outer layer of skin, all the way up to offering an entire body part. He counted the hair and nails as worth it, though the number of gurneys worried him. It meant he'd not been able to keep all the mages' attention. Stupid. I should have waited. Except even that thought rubbed him wrong. He'd known those kids were dead if they took him away from the group. 2 people approached him. One, a man in a sheriff's uniform with bars on his collar. The other, a woman in an all-black outfit. Mr. Randolph, people have a lot of opinions about you, the officer said. They'd taken his wallet when they'd cuffed him, and at this point, Scott figured they knew more about him than he did. Okay, Scott said slowly, not sure what else to say. I assume you're the one that slapped the time bubble up over the kids? Officer Bailey. Scott finally saw a name tag for him, said, while focused on him. They were all sheriffs, not police. In the back of his mind, the trivia that Ventura County ran patrol for Thousand Oaks popped up. But that bit of trivia didn't matter at the moment. Police or sheriffs, he was in massive deep water. Yes, sir, he said simply. At this point, less was more. Remove it, Bailey ordered. Scott glanced at the man in black with the gun pointed at him, then the woman with the sheriff's deputy. You're fine. Pull it down, the woman said, and he took a second to inspect her. Long dark hair twisted up on her head, dark eyes, and a flat mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. Yes, ma'am, he said, ignoring the arched brow from her. With a moment of concentration, the bubble fell, and the shudder of time as the kids caught up rippled through him. The cacophony that burst out of them and parents made him wince. The woman snorted. They are a loud bunch, aren't they? She said in a conversational voice. Scott narrowed his eyes. He'd seen enough police dramas and movies to know that when they were being nice with the prisoner, bad things soon followed. Another snort. Maybe she considered that sound laughter. You aren't a moron. You hurt? Her eyes scanned him as she talked. No, ma'am. He wasn't. Not really. He was sore and stiff, but not hurt. Excellent. She nodded at the other one in all black. Get him to the station. We're using their offices. Make sure he gets fed and goes to the bathroom. We'll be a while. She turned those dark eyes back to him. Continue being intelligent. Be stupid or use magic, and it's less paperwork to have you dead. The words were blunt and matter-of-fact. Scott didn't doubt at all that they would double-tap him without shedding a tear. Yes, ma'am. The person watching him helped him get up, and wasn't as big of a jerk as what he could have been. At this point, he'd take any positive aspect. An hour later, Scott had been given a chance to go to the bathroom, wash some of the dust and blood off his face. He disposed of his button Oxford. It was beyond saving, and the idea of keeping it gave him the creeps. They had gotten him a sandwich, and even let him call Carla to let her know he'd been caught up in the incident at the mall. Such small, insignificant words for how much everything had changed. Carla had asked if he needed a lawyer, and assured him she'd pass the word. It wasn't until he hung up that he pondered over the fact she'd asked if he needed a lawyer, not if he'd been hurt. He was finishing up the sandwich, which, while good, a roast beef sub wasn't his first choice for a last meal. when the deputy and the woman in black came into the holding room. The room was beige, with scuffed walls that screamed of blank desperation and emptiness. A viewing mirror that took up 75% of the wall opposite him, a table that looked like it would collapse under anything over 25 pounds, and two simple metal chairs. The only other things were the inset lights above him and the camera in the corner. The entire place seemed out of time and more depressing than he would have believed, to the point that the deputy and SWAT lady walking in were welcome. Scott shoved the last bite of his sandwich in his mouth, swallowed, and wiped his mouth as they arranged themselves. A swig of soda, another nice touch, and he was ready to talk. The woman leaned against the door, the viewing mirror unblocked by her positioning, while the man, Bailey, sat down with a folder in his hand.
Mr. Randolph, I'd like to hear in your words exactly what happened today and what you did.
The question was a simple statement, but Scott's throat went tight. For a moment, he considered lying, telling them he had nothing to do with any of it. But he took a deep breath, letting the panic wash through him and back out. They would have a spirit mage on the other side of that window, and they'd note every lie he uttered. So, I'll tell them the truth. Maybe they'll let me call my parents before a sentence is passed down. He cleared his throat and swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. This is no worse than the oral examination for your masters. You passed that. You can do this. I was at the mall grabbing lunch and a present for my niece. She's turning 9. I'd grabbed her gift and ordered food for myself and my coworker, Carla. What present? The woman interrupted to ask. A stuffed husky, he said, frowning at the sharp question. That wasn't your familiar that was killed? Her words were fast, but he couldn't tell what she was thinking or feeling. Huh? No, I don't have a familiar. It was life-sized and appeared real, but it was a stuffed dog. My sister, Emily, her mom, is allergic. He glanced back and forth between them, unsure what they were looking for. Continue, Bailey said with a nod. Scott glanced at both of them, but they were unreadable. With a mental shrug, he continued. I ordered food, was waiting for my order when there was a scream. He paused, trying to get it in his head in the correct order. It had happened both so fast and glacially slow that he wanted to make sure he had it correct. I looked around trying to find the source when 6 people in robes showed up herding people into the center. The mall speakers came on with a male voice claiming to be the... He closed his eyes to think. Mage rightful rulers. Someone, a man in jeans, stood up and basically told them to fuck off. Scott sighed as he closed his eyes, the image of the man going up in flames, hyper vivid in his mind. They set him on fire. That took out most people's resistance right there. But not yours. The woman held him with a gaze that stripped him of clothes and defenses. I wouldn't say that. I didn't do anything for a while. They pulled all the kids into the center, hit one of the dads pretty hard. Then we waited. I've been trying to figure out what to do, but time isn't the best defensive spell class. The woman made a sound, but Scott had no idea if it was agreement or disagreement. He took another sip of soda and kept going. After about 30 minutes, the boss man showed up. He said they were going to let 3 kids loose to prove to the cops outside how serious they were. It didn't make sense to me, and I knew if they removed the kids from the area, those kids were dead. Why did you think that? Bailey watched him, taking notes as he talked. Scott fought to put into words what he'd felt, known. If they were negotiating, releasing kids would make sense. But the phrasing of the words, prove they are serious, didn't play with release. It made sense that they were going to kill the kids in front of the cops. It would have shaken everyone up. I couldn't take the chance. His voice trailed off, and all the doubts fought with each other. Then what did you do? I'd set up a decay and an accelerated time bubble on one of the damaged columns previously. I slapped a time bubble on the kids, stopping time for them, and I released the bubble on the column and yelled at people to move. Everything went into chaos then. I was trying to get people away from where the roof was about to collapse. The boss was yelling at the others to kill me. I had limited options. I hit them with a disease in their mouths that caused all the bacteria and viruses in their mouths to grow at accelerated speeds. That's what that was. I was wondering. Interesting use of spells, the woman remarked, and he thought she might be pleased or impressed. Oh yeah, I'd evaporated a few eyeballs. I knew you'd need to ask questions, and not being able to see is traumatic in most creatures. It was all mixing up in his head at this point. Then I think you came in. Jughead, the second in command, was about to kill me. So Scott swallowed hard at this point. I dehydrated his brain. He dropped dead. The boss was behind me, livid. He was about to kill me, but someone put a bullet in him before he succeeded. Bailey said. He asked a few more questions, pulling details out of Scott that he'd missed in his first telling. Okay, you'll be here for a few more hours. We need to finish talking to the other hostages. He rose and made to leave. Scott sighed. When am I to be sentenced? I'd like to call my parents and sister before I'm executed. Both of them froze. The woman, who'd stood up and had been about to leave, stiffened and turned to him. You think you're about to be executed? Scott shrugged. I use magic to hurt people, caused irreparable harm. Last time I checked, that's a death sentence. You knew this and still acted? Her words were probing. I couldn't let all those people, those kids, die. I had to do something. Interesting. She and Bailey exchanged a quick glance. Bailey turned back to him. At this point, you are only being held for questioning. When that changes, I'll let you know. With brief nods, they left, and Scott remained there, more in the dark as to what was going on than he had been. Chapter 4. Disquiet. With nothing to occupy his mind, Scott replayed the actions in the mall over and over, coming up with all the stupid things he'd done. He started with not getting his phone out the second he heard the scream, but then it might not have mattered, as they had said phones were blocked. College taught you a lot about how to use your magic, but they almost never taught you anything about using your magic offensively. Instead, the lessons were strictly functional. He still couldn't quite grasp that he'd blinded, maybe killed multiple people. The worst part? He wasn't upset about it. That revelation sat heavy in his stomach. What did it say about a person? That you were more upset about the fact that you weren't upset about killing people. His head spun as he couldn't get past it. Time crawled so slow, he checked a few times to see if he'd been placed in a time bubble. But every sense magic came up negative. It went on long enough that he didn't know if the police had decided to charge him or if they had forgotten he was there. The door cracked open. He lifted his head to see the woman from the mall walk in. She had 2 cups of coffee in her hand and a bag of nuts under her arm. She didn't smile at him, but she didn't scowl either. Here, I figured you could use some coffee. She set everything down efficiently, then took a seat across from him. She gazed at him steadily, waiting for him to make the first move. He glanced at the clock, which showed 10, but Scott wasn't sure if that was AM or PM. Either way, at this point, it didn't matter. He needed caffeine to get through the rest of this nightmare. Thanks. He grabbed the coffee and found it made just the way he liked it, black with 2 sugars. He arched a brow at her. She smirked. Carla likes you. Was more than willing to share your coffee preference, though she says she wants her 20 back. They must have talked to her hours ago, or he'd been there all night. Either was possible. He was exhausted. Scott chuckled and took a sip. That means the police will have to return it, along with the rest of my stuff. They sat in silence for a minute. The only sound was her opening the bag of smoked almonds and munching on them. Scott let the heat and caffeine filter through him. Finally, he broke the silence. So now what? I haven't had a lawyer assigned to me. I haven't had my rights read. I'm not sure what the procedure is in these situations. Honestly, we don't run into these situations all that often. Most mages are too scared to use their magic outside of their jobs, or on tiny things, such as heating coffee up or cooling it down. She smirked at that, but Scott lifted his coffee in a mock salute to her. There was no chance he was doing anything that might make his situation worse. After a minute, she continued. Right now, the authorities are fighting over you. By the letter of the law, you're guilty. By the spirit, you aren't. The judge hasn't decided, but I might be able to sway them. Scott narrowed his eyes and took a handful of almonds. The smoky nuts awoke his hunger, and he ate a few in quick succession. She exuded casual comfort here, and he didn't know what her presence meant. He didn't have anything to hide. What more could they want from him? I'm sorry, but who are you to sway judges to your opinion? And is that a good sway or bad sway? He'd been completely unable to read her, so he wasn't sure she was on his side. Scratch that. He knew she wasn't on his side. But her decisions might be beneficial to him. You're more patient than most. Good for you. I'm Evelyn Crane, Senior Mage Hunter. Scott's heart and mind froze as he stared blankly at her. The outfit he'd interpreted as SWAT said nothing about her group or rank. It was just Black Ops Standard, or at least what the movies and TV implied those outfits looked like. In real life, they were black cargo pants, black long sleeve shirt, and a black tactical vest. Intimidating, yet uninformative.
And is that a good thing or bad thing for me?
He ate another almond, though now the smoky taste turned to ash in his mouth. She tilted her head, her arms folded on the table.
I'm not sure. You have the ability to think when in a high-pressure situation, something most people don't. You don't panic. You also know when to follow your gut. That's even more rare. You were correct. If they had released the kids, their leader, Marks, was planning on having them drop dead about 10 feet from the cops. The plan was break bonds on their spine, sever it. They would have been dead by the time they hit the ground.
Her voice held no shock or horror. It was calm and matter-of-fact. It made her words worse somehow. Scott forced a bile that rose back down and took another sip of coffee.
Good thing that didn't happen. How many were killed?
Bad guys? Only 3. The ones you hit with the eye dehydration have been spilling their guts for pain meds. It apparently hurts so bad, they're begging for a death sentence. I'm going to have to remember that when I need to extract information from someone before I execute them. There are 4 currently in the hospital. 2 hostages died. Not your fault.
Her voice wasn't unkind, but there wasn't a lot of sympathy either.
If you hadn't acted, a lot more would be dead.
Scott nodded and floundered for something to take his mind off the dead.
So, what swaying are you going to do?
That depends on you,
Evelyn said with a smile, grabbing a few more almonds. On me?
As I said, you impressed me, at least for someone with no training. I'd prefer to tap you for the Mage Hunters. While I know you just started your draft, I'd like you to come work for us as you complete your draft assignment. It pays decent, has some good perks, if you make it through the training.
The smirk never left the corner of her mouth, even as her dark eyes watched him like she was cataloging his every breath.
Me? A Mage Hunter?
The words didn't sound real coming out of his mouth.
Yes.
She sat up in her chair and gave him a hard stare.
Look, right now, assuming we don't find out something game-changing you didn't tell us, you're free to go. Worst case, you're looking at adding an extra year to the draft. Or you work with me, and all your actions will be sanctioned.
She rose.
There's a cop willing to take you back to your car. I'll follow up in a day or 2 and see what you think. But no matter what, you didn't do half bad.
Before Scott could come up with a response, she'd strode back out of the room, and a deputy stood in the doorway.
Mr. Randolph, I'm here to give you a ride.
Scott collected all his belongings, wallet, Carlos 20, his keys, and his flip phone, battery now dead. He made it home in a fog, unsure what to think. When he got home, it was 10 at night, which was odd. He would have sworn he'd been there for days, but it had been less than 12 hours. He avoided processing any of it by falling into bed and passing out until the alarm went off the next morning. How he made it to work on time, he had no idea. He walked into Carla grabbing him and hugging him tight enough his vision went gray on the sides.
I am so glad you're okay. The more the news has talked about that, the more worried I've been. Are you sure you're okay?
She pulled back and scanned him from head to toe, but the only injuries that were visible were the cut on his cheek and a few other scrapes. Most of the damage was to his mind and soul. Scott made himself smile, and it almost felt real.
I'm doing. Just want to get back to normal.
I get that. But bosses said if you need extra time, take it. That had to be stressful.
Her normal smile was gone as she peered at him, her brows creased.
You have no idea. Thanks. But right now, something routine sounds good.
He pushed away her offer and dug in his pocket.
Here's your 20. Sorry I never got you lunch.
Carla took it and laughed.
I'm ordering lunch in today, and it's on the company. Mexican?
Sounds good. Thanks.
Scott escaped her searching eyes and hid in the lab. There were only a few employees at this location, meaning he didn't have any other coworkers to try to avoid. He settled down at his microscope and the circuits that were where he left. He calculated the time rate for the bubble they were under. Longer than the normal test, but it would be an interesting baseline. Scott tried to lose himself in the process, but every 5 minutes, he checked the clock and couldn't stay focused. Carla, true to her word, got lunch. The burrito with queso was good, but her questions, innocently meant, served to only heighten his discontent.
Another 4 years of this?
He didn't know if he could do that. Maybe he needed to take some time. This was a symptom of the stress. That evening, he sat in his empty apartment. He had only what was necessary to live: bed, table, one chair, a recliner, bookcase. TV bored him, and right now, a library card was the most important thing to him. But even a book that he'd been greatly enjoying didn't capture his attention. A glass of whiskey sat on the table to the right, the book on his lap. He stared blankly at the window drapes, seeing nothing. His mind ran through everything on repeat and every mistake he made, all the ways he could have died, the way others could have died, the danger to the kids. The memories beat on him over and over until his body hurt from the tension as he flinched over and over again. The jangle of the wall phone pulled him out of his funk, and he dragged himself up to answer it. Even a telemarketer would be a welcome distraction right now. He hadn't told his parents or sister about it. He wasn't ready to talk. Yet. Scott speaking.
Mr. Randolph, this is Evelyn Crane. I was calling to see how you were doing.
Lightning rushed through him as the offer coalesced in his mind. Yes. The word was out of his mouth with no thought or hesitation.
You are doing yes?
She sounded like she was trying not to laugh at him. Scott swallowed. Yes, I'd like to be a mage hunter. This time she did laugh. Something low, sexy, and deadly as nightshade.
Excellent. Welcome to the squad.
Chapter 5. Lay of the Land. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of life-changing events that Scott barely had time to notice. The draft office notified his boss of his reassignment. Work had a goodbye party, which was pretty much him and Carla going out to lunch. His apartment was packed up and moved by the most efficient group of people he'd ever seen. They had him in a new apartment, completely unpacked, and even set most everything up the way he would have wanted it. The reason for the move was he needed to be within a 10-minute drive of Van Nuys Airport. Where he'd been living was about an hour drive. It turned out to be a much nicer apartment, so Scott had no complaints there. He received a new phone, filled out the forms for his uniform, the basic black BDUs, and then it was Monday. The instructions said to be outside his building by 6 a.m. Standing outside in his khakis, a button-down shirt, and his running dress shoes, Scott pushed away any second doubts. His own excitement and odd trepidation made any other emotion pallid in comparison. A Dodge Viper, Mage Edition, painted in blood red, pulled up, and the window opened to reveal Evelyn staring at him. You coming? Scott jerked his head up and down and slid into the car. Other than his apartment keys and wallet, the only thing on him was the new phone. Evelyn pulled away from the parking lot with the subtle purr of the Viper's engine. You'll get a new operations cleared car in a few weeks. For now, I'll drive when we have a job, though usually that will be the Crown. Make sure you know where we are going, as starting tomorrow, it's your responsibility to get to work. You ready for this? She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, her head never turning. I'm still not sure what this is going to entail, but I think so. Scott didn't mention the flashes of worry over his sanity. Who in the world volunteered to be on the rogue mage squads? Me, apparently. He bit back a laugh at himself and focused on the woman. That's at least realistic. Here's how this works. The next 3 to 5 weeks are going to be getting you suited up, get you into the training schedule, and intro you to the people you'll work with. For the most part, hunters are solitary. We rarely go in with large groups. If you can't eliminate the people you need to solo, then you're the wrong person for the job. I'm your trainer and senior until you get your own territory. She took a curve at speed, and Scott realized he had no idea where they were going. Territory? He asked, figuring he'd learned where they were going soon enough. Each hunter has a territory. The size depends on the population density. The squads try to be set up in a manner that they are never more than 60 minutes from any incident in densely populated areas. This is why your home airport literally has a chopper on standby 24/7 in case it's needed. Scott swallowed at how much that must cost. And they have this set up in multiple places across the U.S.? Evelyn laughed. 107 to be accurate. And don't worry about it. Most of the time it's a military assignment, and it isn't like we keep the flight squad in full active alert status. Besides, they're trained to go from dead asleep
to ready to take off in 10 minutes, just like most firefighters.
That helped make it more reasonable in his mind. He downgraded the image from a full SWAT team with guns, standing next to a midnight black chopper, blades whirling, waiting to take off, to a chopper waiting for a pilot.
Any other questions?
She was turning into a parking lot that contained only a few cars. He had no idea where they were or how to get back here. I need to get a lot more observant. This isn't a game. Or, if it is, I'd like to survive it. With that thought, he scanned the car, inspecting it, as opposed to just accepting it was a car. The interior repeated the theme of red and black, with black leather, red stitching, black dash, red backlighting. It had all the bells and whistles, and there was a stick shift. He glimpsed the edge of a gun next to her right knee against the console. If this was the type of car he got for personal use, he wouldn't complain. She drove around toward the back of the long, low brick building. Why the gun when we met? Why the gun now?
Because not all people who sign up with hunters are mages, and often a gun is faster and more accurate. Your eyeball trick impressed quite a few people, but not everyone can do that on the fly. We can teach most people how to aim and pull the trigger, though.
Evelyn pulled into a parking spot and parked, shutting the car off.
Come on, let's get you suited up, and then I'll introduce you to the team.
He followed her into a building that looked like a small strip mall where either small businesses or storage companies would be located. She used her badge to get in, then headed to a small locker room.
Rule 1. Get used to seeing others naked and them seeing you. If we are trying to stop someone from killing people, no one has any time for modesty or squeamishness, and I can guarantee you, you don't have anything worth staring at, and neither do I, nor any of the others you might meet.
She pointed to a locker.
There should be some sweats and a t-shirt in there. You're on your own for a jockstrap if you need or want one. Normal schedule? Get here by 6:30, an hour of exercise, then training.
Scott nodded. He could see the reason for physical training, but what other? Rather than asking questions, he just nodded.
Come on.
She pivoted, walking through the locker room.
Showers, and here's our gym. Nothing fancy, but enough to make you need the shower.
It was simple, with some free weights, climbing ropes, chin-up bars, and padded floors. Evelyn encompassed all of it in a wave of her hand. Then a turn, and she walked out another door to the left. That led into a hall that resembled any other office hallway he'd ever seen. She walked into a large room with a few chairs around the edge and a video recorder mounted in one corner.
This is the mage training and practice room. You'll be here for at least a month before we let you anywhere near the field.
Evelyn didn't give him time for questions, and Scott didn't want to ask any right now anyhow. He wanted to see what he could figure out on his own, and what would be told to him down the road. She kept walking to another door with a light over it, labeled In Use. It must have paralleled the gym area.
This is the gun and rifle range. You'll be here until you hit sniper on 3 weapons.
He arched a brow at that, and she shrugged.
We want to make sure if you pull a weapon, you'll hit what you aim at. You'll train on the M9 Beretta 9mm, the M16A2 rifle, and the Remington 870 shotgun. You need that for breaching actions. Once you're at sniper on all of them, we'll downgrade it to only weekly range check-ins. Those tend to be fun for the most part, assuming you don't suck.
Scott nodded and kept following her. Another room, this one with 3 large desks with computers, paper tablet, phone, and a nice office chair. But the room also contained a whiteboard at one end and a podium tucked into a corner.
Legal training and your desk.
She pointed to the far one. It was the only one with no personalization.
You'll do your reports there, catch up on news and bulletins, and research fugitives as needed.
That part made sense, though all the movies were seriously inaccurate. Where were the secret rooms, and all the gadgets that they used to get their targets? And Evelyn wasn't a Merlin, and neither was he. Scott didn't know if he was relieved or let down that reality was much more mundane than it appeared in the movies. As they went out, she pointed out a small break room.
I mostly use it to keep drinks and snacks in for post-workout, but when you're here, the fridge, coffee maker, and microwave are available to use.
Scott noted a full pot already made. There were only 2 rooms left, and if his mental map was correct, this facility took up most of the buildings that were attached. Questions burned on his tongue, but he kept his mouth shut, following her.
Okay, last office. The one that says supervisor on it. That's Jim Fielding. He's the regional director for hunters. The territory he's responsible for covers California and Nevada. He might be here tomorrow, but don't expect to see him often. I've been in charge of this territory for a decade, and he'll be retiring next year. I'll apply to move up to his position. Other than HR issues or odd policy questions, I should be able to answer most everything.
She paused to look at him. The entire time, her attitude had been direct, providing the information and moving on. There hadn't been anything personal in what she said, but this last bit of information grabbed him. A decade? You aren't a Merlin, he said leadingly. She arched a brow, and he just waited. If she told him none of his business, he'd leave it at that. Mages ranked from magician, wizard, and archmage all were required to get a college education and then serve 4 years in the draft. Hedge mages didn't need to be tattooed or serve the draft. Their powers were barely there. Mostly people ignored them. But the most powerful, Merlins, were required to serve a decade. But Evelyn wasn't a Merlin. Her dark eyes blinked, and then she shrugged.
Nope. I got pulled in my second year in draft after an incident and realized I was good at it. Probably going to stay in until I hit my 20 and retire. The pay and bennies are phenomenal, and oddly, I like this job, which should tell you I'm a bit of a psycho.
The smile she flashed him wasn't reassuring.
Oh, you'll also be required to take and pass a psyche vow. Tomorrow, I think. Then once every time you have a takedown. That'll be gone into more. We have various teachers come in, and I sit in on all of those. You never know what has changed since the last time. Or worse, what you forgot or twisted up in your head. Always know the laws. It's the only thing that makes sure you aren't the one with the warrant out for you.
Did the guys at the malls have warrants out for them? Scott had been so busy with all the changes in his life that the news faded away before he could watch it to get more information. And he didn't own a computer. Right now, they were still too expensive to justify. He hoped using the computer was part of the lessons. Personal computers were just becoming something you might have at home, and he'd never bothered.
The leader and the second in command, Jughead, I think you called him, both did. Jughead beat and raped a woman, using magic to force her. The leader, Markswell von Hunt, a pretentious name if I've ever heard one, had killed 2 people in a robbery, been caught, and escaped, ranting that mages were the evolved humans, and that they should be ruling, not the powerless mob.
She shrugged.
That takedown wasn't one that left any regrets in my mind.
Scott nodded. And the others?
Sheep who were dumb enough to follow him. Not my problem, and not yours.
Evelyn stopped and gave him a serious appraisal.
We only get orders for people who have earned it. I've never had a takedown that was false. There's a reason soul mages are mandated in all courtrooms, and that they must witness any confession for it to be accepted. This is our job. We aren't the judges, just the executioners.
Scott nodded, letting that sink in. Part of him still rebelling, but he had no issue with the one he knew he'd killed, or even if any of the others had died when he pulled down the roof.
Good. Now come and meet the last part of the team.
She headed to a door with a sign on it. Want to play a game? Chapter 6. Hackers Are Us. Evelyn knocked, waited a minute, then pounded. A second later, the door clicked open, and she pushed the door open, waving Scott in ahead of her.
Billy, you have a camera pointed at the door. Use it,
she snapped, but Scott didn't hear any actual heat in her voice. He followed her wave and stepped into the dimly lit room. Straight in front of him glowed a wall full of huge monitors. To his right, large black cases were arranged against the wall, all with glowing green and red lights, and racks that he'd seen in garages for storage. To his left were bookcases full of reference books and maps. In the middle of it all, with 3 keyboards surrounding him, sat a man on a large chair that would have been perfect in a sci-fi movie. He had pale white skin, a set of enormous headphones around his neck, a t-shirt with something on it, though Scott couldn't tell what, jeans and Keds. The skinny frame and glasses only completed the typical nerd outfit. The man, Billy, Scott assumed, turned his head to grin at them. Scott thought his hair was dark, but since the only light in the room was from the monitors, it could have been purple, and he wouldn't have known. The place looked like something out of a movie Scott had seen once, though he thought the walls of computers existed only in the movies, not that people had rooms dedicated to computers in real life. But then again, he felt like he'd walked into a spy novel, so it was only appropriate. At this point, having the wall open and Q step out with a new gadget would have been welcomed.
This the new guy?
The voice was deeper than expected, and Scott revised his age up. The man might be his age, or maybe older. Evelyn didn't move into the room. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe. Scott couldn't blame her. He didn't want to move from the 2 steps in he'd taken. There were cords spread across the room and a crazy spider web of wiring. He suspected that if he did anything to these machines, his credit history would be tanked for the rest of his life, assuming Billy didn't murder him on the spot.
Yep. Scott Randolph, meet Billy Lassiter. Hacker, geek, felon, and our secret weapon.
Scott could hear the smirk in her voice, even if he couldn't see her face. The smile that had been on Billy's face faded as he turned to glare at Evelyn.
Judgy much? I finished my parole, and they dropped the charges to a misdemeanor. I don't even have to list it on my job applications anymore. You know that. You're the one that recommended the downgrade.
He was almost pouting, his glasses reflecting the green lights.
True, but technically, you still committed a felony and were charged with that crime. What the courts did afterward isn't my purview.
If anything, this sounded like a long-running topic between them. Scott watched them picking up details. The curved lips on Evelyn backed up his suspicion.
Yeah, but it sets a tone. It's not like I go around holding up liquor stores or something. No one got hurt.
His arms folded over his chest, and all of Billy's attention was now on Evelyn.
You're making me out to be an out-of-control geek.
Scott took the opportunity to peer around more. His eyes had adjusted to the gloom, and he spotted the tattoo on the man's temple, along with a bag of Cheetos and a big gulp next to him. The room also had that peculiar odor Scott remembered from college. It wasn't the most pleasant odor, but he wouldn't die either. What caught his attention next was the information on the screens. The room contained a total of 8 screens and 2 lines of 4. At least one of them displayed a text file, but 2 were videos of traffic. Another had the word U.S. Marshals on it. Another was a game? He caught the word Hexen on it. The other 3, he wasn't sure what they were doing.
I know computers are the next big thing, but that seems excessive.
And tone was what I wanted to set, because you're out of control,
Evelyn said, nodding at Scott, who forced himself to pay attention to the current conversation.
Billy is extremely skilled. In fact, he broke into the FBI secure database right after he emerged because, and I quote, I wanted to see if they had anything about aliens.
She didn't move the entire time she spoke, though Billy had thrown his head back and groaned.
Oh, I was 19 and stupid. And if they had any info on aliens, I couldn't find it. It was a total bust. Next time, I'm hacking the OMO. Now if I could just get orders to do it,
he said, his tone cajoling.
I mean, if there had been info, it would have been totally worth it.
Not from me. Try to talk the boss into it, but that isn't a bucket of worms I have any desire to open. Scott,
she said, shooting a look toward him.
For all the bullshit, Billy is good. We often need to find info on people, especially if there's an execution warrant out for someone. Finding them isn't always easy, or putting together exactly what they've done.
Scott tilted his head. What they've done?
Oh, that's the fun part,
Billy piped up. His excitement came through as he talked, his hands waving in the air. It made him appear younger than you usually expected a mage to be, especially after college. Though if he was only a magician, he'd only be required to get an associate's degree. Scott narrowed his eyes, inspecting the setup. No, he'd bet Billy had a bachelor's, and, in his realm, probably qualified for a master's. Fun part?
Yep.
Billy popped the P and spun back to his keyboards.
Let's say you've got an execute on a dude for capping someone in a liquor store holdup. Everything's been verified. No chance of it being a mistake. So you're locked and loaded.
His fingers were hitting a staccato beat on the keyboards as he typed, and one of the screens shifted.
But dude's in the wind. Gotta find him. Well, if we know what they've done before, it makes it much easier. Like the guy yesterday. That execute was sitting out there, but no one knew where he was, so no one grabbed the warrant. Once the call came up, Evie here grabbed it.
Scott heard a low growl from Evelyn and removed that nickname from the possibility of him ever using. Billy, on the other hand, ignored the warning. He kept chattering and typing, shifting from board to board as other screens responded to his fingers.
But lots of them don't go for the big gunfight at the OK Corral. A lot of them disappear, as they got no desire to bite it. You gotta tease out what they did, when and where, and if you think they're in your area. You claim the execute, go grab them, and rest on your laurels.
He hit a key on one of the boards with a flourish, and the information on Markswell filled one of the screens. It listed his friends, and then pics, and one of them was of Jughead. Huh. Okay, that makes sense. But shouldn't most of this already be available either from the defenders or the prosecutor's office? He wasn't 100% positive, but if they tried someone, shouldn't they know this? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Depends on what they were accused of, and the number or type of witnesses. A first person with corroborating video evidence, they won't even bother. The soul will tell if any of the people involved are lying, and the video makes sure what they say they saw is accurate. Evelyn pushed away from the wall.
Also, it lets you know if someone might be after payback or something else.
Billy turned with a smile. What she said. But you got my number in your phone. I'm Wolf. Ah, okay. Scott nodded, assuming it was a computer thing. He had barely turned the new phone on. Everything was coming at him fast, but so far, he was almost okay with everything that he needed to be aware of. He was still unsure of the people. A boss that was never here, a hacker that enjoyed the work too much, and a woman he knew nothing about. That last part vibrated in his psyche. He knew her name, and that she had a car. Not much else. This was going to be a weird job.
Now you've got the rundown. Every hunter group is going to be different. This is mine. Any questions?
Evelyn watched him, like a spider would a fly, getting closer to her web. Scott had zero idea where to start asking questions, so he let it go. In time, he'd figure out the dynamics and processes here, or when he couldn't move forward without the information he required, then he would ask, "What's next?" He tried to keep the overload off his face. The slow smile that spread across her face as they stepped out of Billy's domain should have been friendly, sexy even. Instead, Scott found himself trying to step back, except there was a wall in the way. All he could do was stare at the dangerous woman smiling at him.
Next, I get to put you through your paces. Come on, Mr. Randolph. See if you can impress me again.
The grin promised a world of hurt. You're at least 20 years younger than her. How bad can it be? Chapter 7. Rules and Regulations. It was bad. Scott had thought he was in decent shape. Evelyn was in amazing shape and proceeded to run him into the ground. As far as he could tell, the only thing he was even remotely equal to her in was pull-ups, and that wasn't saying much. When she finished making him drip and sweat, while she was only glowing, she created a workout routine for him.
I'd advise you to show up early and put in some extra time. You never know when the ability to run away is what will save your life.
Evelyn gave him a long look as she patted herself dry before she walked out to the showers. Scott sat on the floor, staring at the walls, trying to convince his legs they could carry him. It took a few minutes. When they finally agreed to try, he staggered into the locker room, only to be faced with Evelyn walking out, stark naked, a towel wrapped around her head. She was wrong about not having anything worth staring at, though. Not her body, though that was nice enough. The scars that litter her back, from the nape of her neck to the backs of her knees, grabbed his attention. What was worse, he recognized what caused way too many of those marks. Cigarette burns, match burns, cuts, all of them stretched across the canvas of her back. "Do I ask?" he said, after he pulled himself together and tamped the low burning rage that bubbled. She was muscular, with small breasts, and with her shoes off, about 5'7". But all he felt was rage and sympathy. Rather than answering, she bent over and pulled off the towel, then stood back up, her hair hitting her butt.
Doesn't matter. Person who did it to me is dead.
"Why not have them healed?" he asked, even as he waited for an explosion. There wasn't one.
Because they made me. Seems stupid to try to erase part of what I am.
She pulled on underwear and a bra as she talked.
But you better get your butt in gear. Today is fill out paperwork day.
She flashed him a smile that was all teeth and didn't touch her eyes. Scott ripped his eyes away and marched to the shower, but the images of those cuts gave him a clue as to why Evelyn enjoyed this job so much. 10 minutes later, he dressed in the outfit that had been waiting for him, and he figured out what he needed to bring with him in the mornings. Obviously, he'd need extra underwear and socks. He hadn't realized you could sweat enough to soak your socks, and he needed to stock up on ibuprofen. The way his muscles were screaming, tomorrow morning would be unpleasant. She was waiting for him outside the door.
Until you get used to working out, it might be wise to get some sports drink and put it in the break room. Now you get to finish shining your life away. Larry is waiting for you.
That name didn't sound familiar, but Scott kept to his ask questions only when he needed an answer right that moment philosophy and followed her. They went to the office room, where a man waited for them,
Mr. Randolph, I'm Larry Walker. You'll find me in your phone under Walkman,
he said jovially, with a firm handshake. Larry Walker was a large black man with a voice that boomed, even at normal levels. Confined to a wheelchair, both his body and his personality overflowed it. Pulling out his phone, Scott noticed there were no normal names in his phone address book. He glanced at it and put the phone away. Scrolling through the address book on a Nokia took more time and energy than he had at the moment. Sir, Scott said, as Larry waved to his desk, the one with a pile of paperwork on it.
I'm here to walk you through all the paperwork and make sure you understand the laws that govern the hunters. Once that is all done, I'll swear you in.
Scott jerked his head up at that. Swear me in? Evelyn had dropped into her own desk and was typing, from all appearances, ignoring both of them. He highly doubted she would miss anything about their conversation.
Yes, swear you in, young man. All hunters are registered as officers of the law under the aegis of the U.S. Marshals. It provides the legal authority to enter any state or territory and execute your warrants.
Larry flashed him a smile.
Remember, it's a U.S. only group. Most countries tend to have their own teams and policies. If you're on vacation in Mexico and run into someone from our watch list, you smile, wish them a good day, and report when you get back. Our laws for execution and other jurisdictions are not the same.
Scott nodded. That part at least made sense, and backed up what the movie said. The Merlin Hunter was a popular show right now, and he'd watched a few. They stressed different laws and jurisdictions. Often it provided a plot device.
Now, I'm going to assume most of your information you've gleaned from the Merlin Hunter or other movies or books, Larry said.
Scott kept his head down as he read through the paperwork, his face flushing. He concentrated on the paperwork about health insurance and what was and wasn't covered.
One thing I remind everyone about, even Miss Crane here, is that regardless of all the shows, we have zero jurisdiction in the AIN.
His voice had a stern weight to it that had Scott glancing up.
They love to show a criminal escaping to the AIN and us following. At this point, there are no known ways to enter the AIN, and regardless of what some lawmakers might want to think, we have zero legal jurisdiction in the AIN.
Okay. Scott was lost about this being important. The AIN, or American Indian Nation, was a mystery with their closed-off lands. He hadn't heard of anyone going in and out of there for decades, though the idea provided fodder for the tabloids.
He's lecturing me. Ignore him. I will get in there someday, because I think they are giving refuge to a warrant escapee.
Evelyn spoke, though she didn't turn her head from what she focused on. Larry grinned.
Indeed I am. Miss Crane takes things too far at times. But back to you. We also train with local SWAT teams and will act as backup for many of the first responders if it is needed to help control the situation.
Scott nodded. He'd heard of that as well. Larry continued.
Please provide beneficiaries on your life insurance forms and make sure you selected investment options for your 401k contribution.
He walked Scott through the rest of the relatively mundane paperwork. The government didn't contribute to draftee retirements, but they made it possible for you to contribute to them. When he completed all the signed paperwork and placed them in the correct envelopes for mailing, Larry rolled into the middle of the room and grinned at him.
Now, for the part I enjoy. What is it you think mage hunters do?
Scott shrugged, figuring it was a trick question. Hunt down rogue mages? Larry snorted.
In some ways, yes. In other ways, not quite. I'm sure Miss Crane explained that we rarely are tasked with apprehending someone that has not been verified as a danger to others, correct?
Scott nodded, wanting to see what the man had to tell him.
That is true, and it is the reason we are allowed such leeway in how we carry out our duties. You will learn how to kill quickly and quietly from a distance and up close. Almost all recruits for this position have come from recommendations from existing agents. They tend to tap people they have reason to believe will succeed in this role, and their accuracy at selecting good people is about 65%. The other 35 either wash out or can't handle what this job requires.
The number was lower than what Scott would have thought.
Many people can kill when their lives or the lives of their loved ones are threatened. It's more difficult to do it when a piece of paper says to, Larry said with a touch of kindness. And some people can't handle the physical aspect. Besides the fact that you are on call 24/7, unless an office shutdown has been instituted or vacation time or sick leave is enforced. It's one of the reasons heavy sleepers are disqualified. Scott could believe the terms of this job would dissuade some people, but he looked forward to getting into great shape, which Evelyn would force him to do. And he'd never been a heavy sleeper. With no current social life, the 24/7 didn't worry him. All execute warrants are signed by a federal judge, not state, though often the court case is tried at the state level. It goes up to the circuit court judge with the evidence, the verdict, and the request for an execute warrant, though often they are called hunt orders. Larry shrugged with a darker expression on his face. That is an old word, but the current media loves the idea of hunting the bad guys.
Scott extrapolated the source of the discomfort from the color of Larry's skin and his own history lessons.
Occasionally, a capture warrant might be issued, but those are rare. Less than 10% of all warrants are captured. That is exactly what it says. You are requested to bring in a person for questioning when normal methods have failed. There is no damage to be done to them, as they may in fact be innocent.
Larry nodded at him.
Though this office rarely gets them. There are 5, last time I checked, strong soul hunters. They take those, as the KO is one of the few ways to bring someone in without issue.
I prefer takedowns. It keeps me relatively local, and I don't have to worry about the condition of the person when I get them. Frankly, I prefer dead. It makes everything easier, especially the paperwork.
Evelyn's voice was matter-of-fact. Scott glanced at her and the tattoos along her temple. With everything going on, he'd noted she was a mage, but not much else. Now he took the time to focus on her tattoo. She was a transformed mage. Those mages could easily kill someone if they had studied the human body. From what Scott knew about her so far, she probably knew more about the human body than most doctors. She also had air and earth. Earth would be a problematic skill to use for a single person, as it tended toward extensive areas of effect. But air could be an interesting one. Everything from illusions to lightning to moving air out of someone's lungs.
Miss Crane is accurate, but that is part of the swearing in. You are required to take an oath to uphold the warrants, the Constitution, and the laws. You are not here to torture or punish anyone. Your job is to execute a warrant, which, a huge proportion of time, means executing the person.
Now Scott did have a question. You say execute, take down, words that aren't kill or murder. Why?
Larry sat up in the chair. You're right. I do like him, Evie.
She glanced up at him with a glare from under her lashes, but didn't say anything. Scott didn't let the frown cross his face. Why do they call her a name she obviously hates?
Because that implies you are making the choice of who lives or dies, or that you have something to gain, be it monetary or emotional satisfaction. By executing a warrant, you have no personal enmity toward the person named. We want to keep it that way. When you get emotionally involved, things get bad. You aren't killing someone. Technically, they pulled the trigger. You're simply the bullet that finally reaches them.
It was an odd metaphor, but as they went over the rules and what you had to do to even get a warrant issued for you, Scott figured he could live with being a bullet.
Now the fun part. Stand, please, and say after me. I, Scott Randolph, swear to abide by the laws and regulations of the U.S. Marshal Service. I swear to uphold both the spirit and intent of all warrants I execute. I also swear to show mercy and kindness to those I am sent after. On my name and honor, I swear this.
Chapter 8. Removing Blinders. One of the least fun parts about the job was the 24/7 nature of their operations. While they could choose their own times to go after anyone whose warrant they picked up, emergency calls could happen at any time. Per Evelyn, those calls were relatively rare. Scott still triple-checked that the phone was near him at night and either fully charged or charging to ensure he didn't miss a call. She'd mentioned an on-call rotation, but told him he wouldn't be on it for a few more weeks. Evelyn filled the next month with getting him into the shape she wanted. It turned out backup for local law enforcement was either sourced to the local hunter squad or their SWAT. As a general rule, the hunter offices would be called if local law enforcement needed the backup. Most departments only had 2 to 3 SWAT members, even the huge departments such as Los Angeles or New York. Mainly because most large departments had at least one spirit mage in their ranks, and a strong spirit could KO a group of people with little offering. The problem with the situation Scott had been in was they had no eyes inside, and didn't know if the terrorists created dead man switches or not. That scenario played out at the World Trade Center last year. It still made most spirit mages twitchy. Between the extensive damage and the number of lives snuffed out, no one wanted to see a repeat. This factored into why Evelyn stressed being accurate with a gun. It had a level of flexibility magic didn't. By the time the first month was done, Scott could dismantle, reassemble, load, and hit targets consistently. He wasn't quite at the sniper level, but Evelyn didn't express any reservations about his ability to hit what he aimed at. It did a lot to his confidence levels as well. There was something about being accurate with the weapon that found him being more secure in his abilities. The big change, besides the constant practice, research, and discussions related to magic and how to use it to kill or disable. Scott thought he'd known how to use his magic, especially after a master's, and then using it daily, but he'd realized he hadn't had a clue.
One of the things you need to keep in your head,
Evelyn said as they stood in the magic training area,
is that college is to make sure you understand the basics and the consequences of using magic. It is not there to teach you how to utilize it to the best of your ability. To be honest, no one wants to admit just how powerful mages could be. Your little eyeball trick is a good example.
She gave him a nod.
It disables, but leaves them functioning, which most of the time is a good thing.
Scott pushed down the discomfort at being reminded of the people he blinded.
What do you mean about power?
She leaned against the wall with a shrug.
Hedgies aren't required to get tattoos, and most don't, as they don't want to be identified as a mage. The commonly accepted main reason is they aren't powerful enough to really do anything with their magic. Maybe light a candle or chill a drink, but that's about it. Our education system isn't set up for them to realize what they can do. Some have figured it out, but those keep their mouths shut, or they get stupid, and an execute warrant is set on them.
I'm missing something. I mean, time is my strong class. Scott frowned, trying to think it through. Evelyn nodded.
Yep, but how much offering did it take to suck the moisture out of their eyeballs?
Her voice was flat, with no intonation. That was almost worse than being curious. 1/8 of an inch of nail for each set, he said, trying to match her tone.
Right, and you're an Archmage. The math is out there if you want to go look. But figure for a Hedgie, it would take 10 times that. So 1/8 of an inch for all 10 fingers, and they could take someone's eyes. 1/4 inch for all 10 fingers, and they could dehydrate someone's brain. And that is as a hedge mage. The ones we regard as so weak, the majority are not even identified.
She stressed that part, and it resonated with implications. Scott swallowed as he processed that. You're saying there are a lot of mages out there killing? Evelyn barked out a laugh, or at least that was what he assumed the sound was.
Right now, there are an average of 3 million deaths a year here in the United States. That is about 8,000 a day. We love to categorize them as an accidental, heart disease, stroke, or whatever type of death. Are you telling me if you sat and thought about it, that you couldn't figure out a way to do that to someone, even if you only had a teeny bit of power?
Scott opened his mouth, then snapped it shut. He could pull the moisture out of the majority artery to a heart, a brain, an eye. It would appear like a blockage, especially since autopsies could take days. Would they be able to figure it out? Wouldn't tests show that? Evelyn shrugged.
Maybe, but unless they have nothing but pattern mages as coroners or pathologists, how could you know if someone's stroke was an outside effect? And even if you did, how do you prove who did it?
She watched him, waiting for an answer. Scott swallowed. Are you saying we have serial killers that are mages? Evelyn groaned.
Of course we do. Probably hundreds. But that isn't what I'm getting at. Any magic branch or class can kill if their magic is used creatively enough. Trust me, if you have enough motivation, you'll figure out a way.
She tapped her back to drive home her point.
What I want you to do is figure out how to use your classes, water, entropy, and time, to do the following. Kill one, kill multiples, incapacitate one, incapacitate multiples. In all cases, the body must be recognizable and retrievable. Go.
Scott set his mind spinning, trying to figure out what options he had with his magic. Oddly, killing was much easier to figure out than restraining or incapacitating. He went through scenarios trying to figure out how to use his magic in ways the college failed to teach and actively discouraged them from thinking about. Incapacitate. Take them out like my time bubble, or have them down for the count, where they need medical attention but can't interfere. Isolating people was simple, but keeping a time bubble up when other things were going on wasn't as easy. Evelyn tilted her head as she thought.
Good point. Let's say both. You never know what you might get into.
And that is what they did, played with how to use his magic. Occasionally, she'd show him hers, but she was ruthless, though that was coming from someone who shriveled eyeballs. She tended to just kill. At the end of the day, he'd fear himself more than her coming after him. He tended to wound in such a way death was a relief. Her favorite was severing the spinal cord with break pattern. She was good enough that she could leave them alive if she wanted them to be able to talk and breathe, but not move. It was a creepy realization that most people could do this if they took the time to learn the spine and focus their abilities, but most people were lazy, which was fortunate. With his magic, always with the idea that someday he'd be in the field by himself, they narrowed down the best ways for him to use it. It required them to study a bunch of anatomy books and talk to a doctor that came in to lecture, but they narrowed it down to the fastest, most efficient methods possible, if cruel. Kill one, dehydrate brain. Kill multiples, call water into lungs. Render one unable to interfere, time bubble. Render multiples unable to interfere, time bubble. Take out, but not kill one. If water is available, control water and freeze. Take out, but not kill multiples, dehydrate eyeballs. It took most of the month to get that down to a flow he could do without thinking. By the time they reached that state, he dropped 20 pounds, had to go down a pant size, and used up over a foot of hair. His hair rolled at the shoulder level, the shortest he'd had it since middle school. Then they got to play with the sheriffs and the local army base. He found he rather enjoyed clearing the rooms and seeing how they mixed magic and tactics. Part of him realized why Evelyn had never left the job. It was both addictive and fun. Getting to use your magic outside the narrow guidelines that college beat into him was liberating and deadly, especially if you didn't want a warrant out for you. Overall, Scott enjoyed the job. The pay was good, if lacking in benefits as a draftee. After a month of being almost hip to hip with Evelyn, he knew what she looked like naked, that she had a dark, narrow sense of humor, and that she had an unnatural ability to eat spicy food. That was it. He didn't even know her middle name. Billy, he was pretty sure he knew everything about. His first pet, dog, Rover. Favorite car, Evelyn's. And favorite food, chocolate cream pie. The few times they took a lunch out, Billy would come with, and he'd spend the lunch in a frenzy of chatter. But it was always interesting about the new internet and how things were changing already. Billy had proven to be older than Scott thought. 29, not early 20s, making him 2 years older than Scott. But he had a youthful outlook and enthusiasm. Plus, since he almost never saw the sun, his skin was smooth and gave him a baby-like appearance. Scott thought he might be ready when the first call came, but it wasn't a warrant, it was assistance. Chapter 9. Fire. Scott stepped out of the shower after the workout, looking forward to a cup of coffee. Anything besides a sports drink and a protein drink before the 2 hours of physical training did him no good. But afterward, a single cup with cream and sugar was a nice reward. He never possessed much of a sweet tooth. He enjoyed watching people, figuring out what made them tick, which is what made Evelyn interesting. Her history implied a revenge or vengeance proponent of her life, but for anything else about her, he didn't have a clue. Standing in the break room, he savored that first sip of coffee when he heard the door to Billy's domain crack open.
Yo, yo, yo! We got a request for assistance. Priority 1. Gear up and get ready to go.
Scott blinked, then set the coffee down and sprinted to the lockers. He had stripped to his briefs when Evelyn came racing in, stripping with the same speed as they both pulled on black tactical pants, undershirts, tack shirt, vest, and then hooked on his equipment. They had practiced this over and over. He could go from fully dressed to changed in 3 minutes. It usually took Evelyn an extra 30 seconds to get everything settled over her chest if she hadn't already been wearing a sports bra. They were back in Billy's office as he printed off sheets for them.
4-alarm fire at an apartment complex in North Hollywood. They have residents still in the building, but they've got a shooter. From what they can tell, the shooter is moving in between rooms, and they can't find the unsub. The person or persons has already put 2 firefighters in the hospital and shot out the tire of an ambulance. They're requesting immediate assistance.
As he finished speaking, Billy handed them the paper.
Go.
For a second there, the young kid had disappeared, and a man in control of his world appeared. Scott blinked, then grinned, before spinning to catch up to Evelyn, who was almost to the front door. She raced out the front into a black Crown Victoria. She was already in the driver's seat and started up the car, blue lights bursting from the grills as Scott dove in. Evelyn slapped the papers in his hands. You're navigating. Go. She backed out before he'd finished getting buckled in. The paper Billy gave them included turn-by-turn directions and the building blueprints, as well as the rundown of their contact at the scene. Right, next light, Scott said, as she raced down the street. He found himself torn between reviewing the information and making sure she didn't hit anyone. She drove like she was part of the car. It intimidated him. Obviously, we need to get you some driving lessons. I thought you drove, she said. She turned the wheel and gunned the gas at the same time. They went around the curve his body leaning into hers with a centrifugal force. I do drive. I don't become part of the car, Scott replied. And yes, if this level of driving is required, I'll need to get some practice in.
And a new car,
she sniffed. My Nissan Stanza is fine for now. It gets me to the office.
It's a Nissan Stanza,
she said, casting him a mocking glance.
Haven't you figured out Mage Hunters are sex icons? A Stanza is a mom car.
Scott snorted, his masculinity not affected at all. Let me get a paycheck or two in, and then we'll see. Evelyn shot him a startled look.
Didn't you read everything you signed?
Yes, I read every paper. Left here, straight 2 miles. Fire will be on the right. The last part was unneeded, as the second she turned onto that road, the smoke billowing up from the building up ahead, plus the flashing lights, identified it.
There should have been one about a lump sum to get you a car. You need one with lights in case something like this happens while you're at home.
She stepped on the gas, flying toward the burning apartment. Nope, he said, his hand white on the oh shit handle. With Evelyn, there should have been another one so he could brace better.
Huh. I'll check with Larry and Billy,
she muttered as she hit the brakes and slid the car to a stop next to the fire trucks and police cars. She was out, had the M162A slung on her back, and was trotting over to the fire chief before Scott managed to get out of the car. I've got to get moving faster. The fact that a woman almost 20 years older than him managed to smoke him regularly put extra speed to his movements, and Scott was only 30 seconds behind her. He caught up in the middle of the man speaking, a Chief George, if the name badge was correct.
We've had shots come from the broken out windows on the 3rd floor, but we got a family with 2 kids on the 4th, and an elderly couple. The manager promised they'd bring a resident list, but we don't have time to wait for it. We need them neutralized so we can get the water in there. Already it might be too late to save the building.
His voice was raspy from smoke inhaled over a career of firefighting, but Scott processed every word with crystal clarity. A few ideas popped into mind, but he watched Evelyn. She sighed.
You have anyone inside at the moment?
Nope. We were about to go in when the person started shooting.
Evelyn crossed her arms, focused on the building.
You have any water mages?
No. Firefighters in this area pays too low to attract strong mages, unless you're an adrenaline junkie. And frankly, those guys are too much work to deal with.
The captain answered instantly. Can we get 2 jackets and helmets, and the hose that has water in it? Scott asked, thinking about what he could do with the water in a burning building. The captain flicked his eyes up to read the tattoo on Scott's temple. Everyone learned the 3 branches and 4 classes. Understanding the symbols for most people was as basic as reading.
I can do that.
He turned and barked out orders. Scott arched a brow at Evelyn. My thought? Go in as firefighters. I use water to isolate them. We take them down, let them know, and decide from there.
And if it's a mage?
Evelyn didn't challenge Scott. She just asked. Then, according to Section 2.10.1 of the Mage Laws, hunters have the right to issue a provisional execution warrant. His mouth went cottony as he said that, but he didn't glance away.
Nice to see you've been studying. Let's try it.
She said nothing else as they got dressed in the provided jackets and helmets. The chief gave them a hose.
It's live, but half pressure. That way, if you open it to get water, you shouldn't have any issue controlling it.
He had a certain weight to his words that made Scott smile. So don't try to knock anyone over with it?
Exactly. I set the radios on the coats to my headset, but no one else's.
He jerked his head at the radio attached to his coat.
Hurry.
The chief raised his head to watch the smoke climbing into the sky, and Scott grimaced. It had only been 5 minutes since they'd gotten here, but the fire appeared to have increased almost exponentially. Scott nodded, grabbed the hose, and he and Evelyn trotted in. They didn't have respirators, just the shields, but Evelyn kept a flow of fresh air to their faces with her air magic. A relief, if Scott was being honest. The stairway at the end they entered was open to the night air. Scott and she moved up them as fast as they could in the equipment and dragging the hose.
I'm adding weight vests to our workouts,
she muttered behind him, and Scott let out a laughing groan. They got to the 3rd floor, and Scott wrenched open the door. I said let them all burn! A scream followed the noise of the door. Then a bullet impacted the wall to the left of them. Scott pulled back the handle and let the torrent of water stream down the hall. There wasn't a response that he could hear, The crackle of fire was louder than he'd realized as it ate through material like a swarm of hungry locusts. I'm going in. I have to see something to freeze it. Keep the water flowing. He laid down as he spoke.
Don't get killed. I almost have you trained,
Evelyn said dryly, as she pulled her 9mm and leaned away from the door. Wasn't planning on it, he sniped, as the elbow crawled down the hall, the water soaking him and his clothes. The smoke was everywhere, and without being next to Evelyn, it got harder to breathe. The running water helped, as did the open door, pulling the smoke outside. He was halfway down the hall when he heard something. Scott froze, trying to listen for something above the ravaging crunching of the fire.
Help! Help!
The voice of a child crying out. That coughing was heavy and harsh.
Come on, asshole. Show yourself.
They're all going to die. They deserve it.
A swirl of smoke and movement. A man stepped out, standing with a respirator on his face. That told him much, and also gave him the target he needed.
Flow and freeze.
Magic demanded a quarter inch of all his hair, but Scott paid it without a flicker of hesitation. The water that streamed around him flowed to the man, wrapping around him and freezing as it encased him.
What? No! Stop! They have to pay!
He yelled and flailed as ice encased him. Scott jumped to his feet and rushed him, topping him over into the water that washed over the top of him. He grabbed the gun and hurled it toward where Evelyn was. That would tell her all she needed as he let the water lock the man in its icy embrace.
No! You have to let them die! They must be cleansed!
The only attention Scott paid him was making sure ice immobilized him, and that he didn't have a tattoo. Then he grabbed the radio. We've got him. It's clear up here.
Roger.
Came back instantly.
Evelyn, can you keep the air on me?
Scott called out, trying not to cough. A fresh gust of air swept around him in response. He turned toward the door he'd heard the call from. Vague memories of movies had him check the door. It was hot. He couldn't remember anything else he was supposed to do. Watch out. I'm kicking the door in. I heard a kid behind it. Chapter 10. Heroes. She nodded, and he pulled up the water to protect them as he lifted his foot and kicked. The door burst apart in a spray of shards and flying embers, and a wave of flame splashed out, but the wall of water he had waiting neutralized it. He sent it flooding into the room. The heat of the room was turning it to steam, making it hard to see. He didn't have time to run back and open up the hose all the way. Are you in here? Can you hear me?
Help!
A tiny voice called. In the apartment and to the right. Scott pushed more water in and froze it, which had the bad side effect of making it hotter, but it gave him the clearance to run through the doorway. He stood in a small 2-bedroom apartment, and he ran toward where he thought he'd heard the voice.
Evelyn, I can't see,
he coughed out. A whirl of smoke surrounded him and cleared as she worked her air magic to open the way for him. There, on the bed, with flames licking around them, sat a small Hispanic girl, holding on tightly to a squirming and terrified calico cat. He pulled more water, his offerings vaporizing as he had it splash and flood the area, smothering the flames. Cautiously, he moved forward as the floor looked less than sturdy. The creaking as he stepped on it didn't reassure him.
Hey, ready to get out of here?
He asked as he got close to her. She appeared to be about 6, and her arms were bleeding where the cat had struggled, but the girl hadn't let go.
I can bring Tigger, right?
The expression on her face implied she thought he might leave the cat to die in the fire. Scott choked at the idea.
We would never leave Tigger behind.
He grabbed her pillow and pulled off the case, and in a quick movement, shoved the cat inside. He grabbed the girl and the cat, the pillowcase protecting them from Tigger's claws. He lifted her to his left side, her legs wrapping around his waist, the cat safe in the bag between them.
I'm coming out. Clear the way. Things are bad.
The shout was all he had time for, as the floor he stood on sagged. He raced back out as he heard the water boiling from the heat. Evelyn had the man by the feet and was dragging him out over the ice, as her air kept them breathing. They met real firefighters coming up the stairs. Once they were outside, Evelyn switched to using air to help lift the man. They got the idiot, the girl, and her cat down to the bottom. A sobbing mother and father quickly claimed the girl. They'd been down in the laundry room when the fire first broke out and couldn't get back up to her. The firefighters got the other people out of the building with only 2 casualties. An elderly woman had succumbed to smoke inhalation, and a woman was dead with a bullet wound in her chest. All attempts to save the building were in vain. Scott and Evelyn sat watching the fire while they waited for the police to take custody of the man. He was currently unconscious, thanks to a paramedic accidentally sticking him with a needle full of hydromorphone. The fire chief walked over and nodded to him, his hat in hands.
Thank you both. I'm sure more people would have died if you hadn't come to our request for assistance.
Evelyn shrugged.
We're glad we could help. Be aware, the man acted like he wanted everyone to burn. There's a strong chance it was arson.
She said nothing else, and Scott nodded in agreement, too tired to say anything at all.
I'll let the inspectors know. Thanks again. If either of you ever want to try for the Firefighters Academy, you've got my recommendation.
The chief moved away to finish managing the scene, and 2 police officers strode up to them. For a moment, Scott thought they were here for him, a rush of deja vu slamming into him. Their first words kicked him back to the present. This the idiot? One of them, an Asian with short black hair, said, nodding to the man at their feet.
Yep, he's out at the moment due to an accidental injection,
Evelyn said, tilting her head at the ambulance. Both men smirked.
But you'll probably need a psych eval. He didn't sound completely there. Definitely aggressive.
The white officer bent to check his temple. Not a mage. Not sure if that helps or not. Evelyn made a coughing sound.
It means it's your problem, not mine.
Gee, thanks. The officer slapped handcuffs on the unconscious idiot, then lifted him up and got him wedged in their patrol car. We done? Scott asked. The smoke had seeped into every bit of him, and it wasn't the yummy smell of smoked meat or pine wood.
Yep, let me check with Billy.
She pulled out her phone and hit a preset.
Yo, how's the bonfire?
Billy's irreverent voice came out tinny and small.
It's out for the most part. Anything else popping for tonight?
She stood and stretched as she asked that.
Nope, all quiet as a tomb.
Great. Put us as unavailable unless there is an emergency. We've earned the night off.
Scott could hear the rapid tapping of keys as he got to his feet as well.
Done and done. Enjoy your evening, guys and gals.
Evelyn rolled her eyes and hung up. She glanced at him.
Consider yourself free as soon as we get back to headquarters. Feel free to drink, get laid. Otherwise, act like you're a college student until 6 a.m. Monday morning.
Ooh, a weekend off. However will I handle it? Scott said, his voice laden with sarcasm as he got in the car.
Your problem, not mine,
she said as she pulled out.
I know that I'm taking a shower when we get there. No way am I getting into my car smelling like this.
She sniffed her shirt and gagged.
Ugh. I can't even put a name to what this smells of, but I don't wanna.
Scott laughed. Agreed. You going to do anything fun? It was the first weekend off he'd had since he started, and he wondered if he could get up to see his sister. He'd had to send a card and money as an apology for missing his niece Megan's birthday, and as a present.
Meh, I'll do stuff. What about you?
She said, as the car accelerated away from the remains of so many lives. Depends on family. They all live up above Sacramento, and it's a long drive. She nodded.
Don't have an answer for that, but your ID gets you military discounts on flights, if that helps.
Huh. He frowned, thinking about that. But today was Thursday. 2 days up there wasn't much. Do we get holidays and stuff off?
Usually, unless there's something big going on. Most of the offices take the holidays, though some of us volunteer to work. It's better than dealing with overcooked turkey in crowds.
If possible, she'd driven even faster back, the lights still flashing until she was pulling into the parking lot. Oh, then maybe I can go see them then? I can volunteer to cover one holiday, while you take the other? He offered, as she shut off the engine. Evelyn lifted a shoulder.
Right now, I'm showering. Smelling like lavender sounds much better than this odor.
She stepped out of the car and headed to the door.
I have first dibs on which holiday. I want Christmas off.
She was through the door before Scott managed to get his belt undone and get out of his clothes. He laughed, shaking his head, and followed her in. While his soap wasn't lavender, Irish Spring sounded much better than his current odor. Scott didn't think he'd lingered, but by the time he got out of the shower, she was gone, as was Billy. The place echoed like a ghost town, which was odd, since most of the time there were only 3 of them here anyhow. His Nissan was waiting for him, and he drove home, paying much more attention than normal. Driving tended to be his zen time, and he enjoyed the wind down. Music had never called to him, but the rush of air through the windows helped clear away the last of the smoke that had settled down in his nostrils. Pulling up to his new apartment, he sat contemplating it. It was in a decent neighborhood. He had a small balcony, one bedroom, and a large living room. Maybe he should think about getting a TV or even one of those personal computers. He'd never be a hacker at Billy's level, but becoming better when navigating the World Wide Web wouldn't be amiss. Billy's exasperation with him often gave him the impression even a kindergartner could do better. He pushed the odd thoughts away and stepped out into the warm air of Southern California. The sound of traffic, kids, and the occasional bird provided a delightful contrast to the hungry flames he could still hear in his mind. Scott fixed his mind instead on the beer he had in his fridge and some books he'd been too exhausted to read. They were due back to the library next week, meaning he better get reading. Opening the door to his apartment, a flash of white on his dark brown carpet grabbed his attention. Bending over it, he picked up an envelope that someone slipped under his door. Nice apartment, but it needed better weatherproofing. But given that it was Southern California, that step got skipped a lot. It was a regular white envelope with no address on it. Scott got in and shut the door before opening it.
This is all your fault. None of this would have happened if you'd been quiet like they told you. You should have suffered instead of me. You have nothing to lose that can compare to my loss.
The words were in block print with a pencil. It wasn't signed or addressed to anyone. It read more sad than scary. Scott stood in the middle of his apartment, staring at it. Finally, he folded it back and put it in the envelope. He'd show it to Evelyn and Billy on Monday. For now, a beer and the new Clive Cussler book were calling him. Chapter 11. First Execute. 2 months sped by in a whirl of training and workouts. Scott thought he almost might be up to Evelyn's fitness level. Maybe. She didn't run him into the ground anymore, though he swore she still looked much fresher than he did after their runs. It turned out Larry forgot the car paperwork. The details read the car belonged to the Mage Hunters until he completed a full 4 years of service as a hunter, at which point they would transfer the car into his name. It would mean a minimum of 6 months over his draft to keep, but Scott figured he'd cross that bridge when it arrived. The paperwork provided him a long list of options and models, some even custom, like what Evelyn had. Though by following the asterisks, it showed that hers was a replacement car for working with them for more than a decade. Bribery, the way to an employee's heart. Eventually, he decided on the Nissan 300ZX. It had the power he needed to get someplace fast, a decent amount of back seat and trunk space, and wasn't so unusual that it attracted attention like Evelyn's car. His one odd request was to have it painted the same blood red color as hers. When asked about that, he shrugged. Thought team members should be recognizable. She had only smirked and let it be. They were in their office, working on researching existing warrants. As each hunter had their own territory, you had to look at what warrants were available, see if that person had any contacts or reasons to be down here, then request information or monitoring on those people. Filling out surveillance requests and making a list of triggers for Billy could take up a good portion of their day. Scott practiced constantly with his abilities. Scott had discovered that what college taught you were the mainstream functionalities for magic, not the end-all be-all like he thought. He joined the Nick Society, and Evelyn let him know she belonged to the Elementals. They both visited the Society's website and bulletin board regularly, as well as received the monthly physical newsletters. Both he and Evelyn discovered new methods by following the message boards in their houses to figure out what else you could do with your magic. All the stuff I didn't know. Scott shook his head as he initiated another wiretap request for the sister of a mage who had killed his wife and kids. Though given the trial transcription, he'd be astonished if the man's sister didn't kill him on sight. She had been livid. I've got one. Billy's voice rang out through the speaker system. Scott saved what he'd done so far. Word perfect was nice, and that it saved him from handwriting all of this, but if he didn't carefully save it every time, the software program, with its glowing green letters, would gladly eat your work. At times, Scott swore that was literal. As far as Scott was concerned, the program took great joy in telling him, "File not found." You coming? Evelyn was standing at the door, waiting for him. Scott nodded. Yep. He got up, grabbing his Nokia and a pen and pad of paper. He preferred being able to jot notes down as Billy spoke. Even with all the information Billy would hand them, there was something about taking notes that helped connect details in his mind. Nerves jangled along his spine and twisted his stomach up. Their first execute warrant, finally. The lack of activity had concerned him until he had asked Evelyn if they weren't getting jobs because of his newbie status. Evelyn had looked at him with her eyes wide.
Scott, how many takedowns a year do you think the average hunter does?
He blinked at that. I'm not sure. 20 or more? She started laughing, and it was the first non-cynical laughter he'd heard from her. She had a high, almost girlish laugh, not what he was expecting. It also hadn't been the response he expected.
Most people are much more law-abiding than that. Breaking the law carries consequences that few people are willing to face. Los Angeles is one of the busier areas in the US. I think only New York has more issues, which is why NYC has 2 hunters. Our average is about 8 a year. I get more calls for assist than I do for execute warrants. So no, we aren't taking it easy on you. It's just quiet. A happy hunter is a bored hunter.
The level of sincerity in her voice had settled his concern slightly. At least that is what she'd said then, but the eagerness in her eyes right now disproved that. She'd been overly wired the last week or so, and Scott suspected she needed a hunt to expend some energy. They headed out the door. He followed her to Billy's cave. She pushed open the door, not bothering to knock.
What do you have for us?
This one is going to be hard, Evelyn. I'm warning you.
Billy had turned to meet them, and in the green glow of the monitors, his eyes looked dark and serious. The normal excitable attitude was gone. Instead, grimness surrounded him like a cloak. Evelyn paused.
What do you mean, hard? Like dangerous hard?
Like, you're not going to want to take it hard.
His voice was darker than Scott had ever heard. She stilled, and Scott glanced back and forth between them. Sure, he'd missed some context here. Why wouldn't she want to do the execute? Evelyn took a deep breath and let it out.
It's my job. Give me the details.
Her voice was brisk, almost harsh. Billy matched her actions and released the air in his lungs.
I'll have a bottle of Captain Morgan waiting for you when you get back.
If anything, she went even stiller. Her fingers didn't twitch, and Scott thought she might have quit breathing.
So noted,
she whispered. Then, in a stronger tone.
So, deets?
He turned back around and pulled things up on his monitor.
Our execute is 25 Carolyn McRae, convicted of killing by magic 3 men and abducting a 4th. She's a pre-emergent college student, and 3 of them went to college with her, though they claimed to not have known her.
Scott nodded at that. Just because you were in the same school, even the same class, didn't mean you knew everyone. Some of the colleges were big, and even your own class could be 1,000+ kids. Pre-emergent in college meant that most of her family were mages, and everyone expected her to be one. So she got basic classes out of the way while she waited. It wasn't common, but it wasn't uncommon either.
Per her testimony, the 3 drugged her and raped her multiple times.
A sudden hiss of anger from Evelyn, but Billy kept plowing on through.
She wasn't a mage when they raped her. She emerged while in the hospital after the assault. It went to trial, relatively showy and media heavy. The lead defense destroyed her on the stand, showing pictures of her wearing short skirts and heels. Between her presence at a party, and they got a prior lover up on the stand where he admitted she liked it rough, her character was crucified.
Billy gave air quotes around the word admitted. It wasn't possible to lie while in the witness stand. There was a reason any soul mage could get a job if they wanted to, even if they were a hedgie, though that often required getting a tattoo. Being able to tell when someone is lying meant you could make money just by listening to people talk. But that didn't mean the whole truth was always told. If you believe in what you said, it came across as the truth, which was why there were still trials.
Even though the jury knew she said no, they were convinced by her outfits and her previous relationships that a rapist would have assumed she was playing hard to get. Plus, when she took some drugs, it would have sounded like a tease.
Billy's voice was full of contempt and anger that Scott could agree with.
What did they drug her with?
Evelyn's voice was flat and controlled, in a direct contrast.
The medical personnel didn't do a blood draw when she was admitted, so there was no verification. But friends suggested they had been talking about Liquid X. The problem was everything was hearsay, and the defense prevented them from being asked directly about the drug use.
Billy sighed. Evelyn had completely shut down. What little humor she usually had vanished.
You said 4?
Yeah, the 3 rapists, and they know she took the defense attorney. Multiple witnesses. She walked away after leaving their bodies on gory display. She's an angry Merlin. The judge signed the execution warrant after reviewing the videotape evidence.
Billy's voice had dropped at the last. Scott picked up asking questions as Evelyn's attention was focused on the screen. listing the trial results.
Merlin. What type? Fire and air is strong. Relativity and entropy is pale, replied Billy.
Scott winced. Fire mages were easily the most obviously deadly,
Too bad it wasn't psychic as strong.
Evelyn muttered. Scott and Billy both stared at her. Scott assumed his face matched the questioning expression on Billy's. Evelyn shrugged.
If so, she could have forced them to tell the truth in the courtroom. That may have prevented all this.
She shook off whatever pensive mood had gripped her.
Still, going about killing people in plain sight isn't the answer. Location?
Last seen headed toward Garvey Ranch Park with one person, presumed to be the defense lawyer. She grabbed him outside his office about an hour ago.
Billy turned and handed a stack of papers to Scott.
Here's the information. MapQuest directions and her mugshots.
Okay, let's get geared up.
She turned and headed to the lockers, even as Scott lingered for a moment.
Is there something I should know?
He asked Billy, nodding his head backward toward Evelyn.
Probably, but not my story. Better get, Billy said,
turning back to his computers and information coming in. Scott filed that away and chased after Evelyn.
We'll take my car to the airport. Billy's warning them now. Garvey has enough open area to land. It should be fine.
Scott nodded and suited up, not asking the question that hung in the air. Were they going to kill this young girl? Chapter 12. Two Wrongs. Evelyn's coldly methodical speed had Scott closing his eyes, sure they were going to die, but she never lost control for a second. That didn't stop his sigh of relief when she flipped off the engine.
Really? You sure you can handle this? If my driving makes you nervous,
she said as she unbuckled.
You drive like a maniac, he countered, and I'm not sure you realize how fast you drive.
A slow smirk turned up one corner of her mouth.
Oh, I know. I find it amusing that it worries you.
She got out and reached in the back to pull out the M16A2 in a case.
This might be easier depending on what we find.
She turned and strode toward the hangar she'd parked in front of. Grabbing his vest and double-checking his Beretta, Scott followed, his own reluctance making his feet heavy. They were at one end of the airport outside a hangar. The chopper revving up drowned out the noise of other airplanes coming in and out. He followed Evelyn through the hangar to the other side, where three men in blue military uniforms waited for them. Evelyn was already talking to one in a jumpsuit when he got there. Scott stood back for a second to gaze at the helicopter. It was blue and white, with nothing written on it but the call signs on the back fin. He didn't know enough about helicopters to use the right terminology, but the blades whipped through the air precariously close to the humans on the ground. Scott swallowed hard. He'd already had one person's blood splattered across him. That was enough for his lifetime. The pilot nodded and pulled his helmet on, getting into the pilot's seat of the chopper. Evelyn turned to wave to him, then she climbed into the back of the little death cycle.
I went insane at the mall. That is the only explanation.
Scott kept that thought in his mind as he crouched, getting closer to the helicopter, and then climbed in. Evelyn had a headset on and handed him another one. He pulled on the headphones, sighing in relief as the ambient noise level dropped.
Buckle up,
she said over the headset.
This might get bumpy.
Scott made sure the seat buckle was latched as another person slammed the door to the chopper closed and pounded on the sides. A moment later, the noise outside the headphones spiked, and the chopper moved. He peered out the window, and a smile crept across his face as it rose into the air. The ground below turning into a mosaic of colors, though given that this was California, it consisted mostly shades of browns and yellows. Fascinated, he kept watching the ground get farther away, the sway of the aircraft eliciting another smile as the pilot banked, and they flew toward their destination.
You don't like my driving, but you enjoy this?
A stiff voice said over the headset. He turned to peer at Evelyn, who had both hands holding on, knuckles white.
This is amazing. I need to do this more.
Scott couldn't stop the grin on his face as they flew over the landscape.
You are a sick and twisted individual. Give me cars any day of the week,
Evelyn muttered.
I'm taking a taxi back.
You've done this dozens of times,
Scott protested, glancing at her.
Yes, and I've crashed twice. Once I was in the hospital for a week. These things suck.
She kept a tight hold with both hands.
Yet she never hesitated to get into this. Odd woman.
Scott let her be, and his joy only faded when the pilot spoke over the headset.
I'm sitting down in the baseball field. Watch your eyes. The sand will be kicked up by my rotors.
Got it.
Evelyn said in a clipped voice. A minute later, Scott's stomach rose as the helicopter dropped straight down, then landed with a soft thud.
Everyone out.
The pilot barked, but Evelyn already had the door open and was hopping out. Scott pulled off the headset, dropping it on the seat, and followed. The solidity of land a disappointment after the ethereal sensation of being in the air. They both got out of the way of the rotors and waved the pilot up. They stood there for a moment until the noise of the chopper faded. Now what? Scott asked, looking at the park. A few people were there, either watching with wide eyes or racing toward their cars to flee. At least there hadn't been a baseball game going. That might have been awkward. Evelyn pulled out her phone, a newer model than his, something called a BlackBerry, and peered at the screen.
Billy says head into the trees, and she is destroying park equipment. Someone called it in. Police are staying well back.
Scott nodded and sank into himself, focusing on the mission and not his doubts. They ran toward the trees, and the closer they got, the more his magic sense filled up. You could sense when magic was being used if you were a mage. It wasn't a precision thing, more like a wind flag. It would tell you where the magic was coming from, and if it was strong or not, but that was about it. Either way, it told him someone was using a lot of magic to the southwest of them. Evelyn must have sensed it too, as she pivoted and headed that direction. They were moving through the trees quietly, but the cover wasn't enough to even worry about not being spotted. If someone looked their direction, two people with guns moving through the trees would have been obvious. Up ahead, in a clearing with gazebos and a playground, a woman stood. She had a picnic table being torn to shreds with fire and air. Puffs of sparks would occur when the fire hit pockets of pitch or varnish. What disturbed Scott the most was the man splayed across the slide, naked. Even from the 200 yards away, Scott knew he was dead. There was something about the way he lay that no one alive could have achieved. She had long blonde hair and was wearing a sundress that blew in the breeze as she stood there. The woman turned and faced them, her face matching the execute warrant, except for the dark smudges and the haunted look in her eyes.
We need to give her a chance to surrender,
Evelyn said. Scott nodded in agreement. Unless there was immediate risk of loss of life, they always had to give a warrant recipient a chance. You never could tell, and the government preferred everything to be as clean as possible.
Carolyn McRae, there is an execute warrant out for you. You are under orders to surrender.
Evelyn used her air magic to make the words carry across the distance. Scott felt it whisper at him as she spoke. She spun in a circle before she faced them again.
They got a warrant for me? You're here to kill me, aren't you?
Her voice had an odd, jagged quality to it. Evelyn sucked in a hard breath that had more emotions to it than her words did.
Yes. Don't struggle. Don't make this harder than it has to be.
A hard, bitter laugh exploded from the girl.
That's what they told me. Don't struggle. It'll be over soon.
Evelyn flinched, and Scott waited for her to sever the woman's spine, but she didn't.
And the dead guy?
Evelyn's voice was flat.
Him?
She turned to look at the man on the slide.
Their defense attorney. He asked me, why didn't I just lay back and enjoy it on the stand? You know, they never denied having sex with me. They said I wanted it, that I was dressed for it, that me taking drugs meant I'd planned on a gangbang. That's why the jury didn't convict them, because I didn't struggle hard enough.
The manic sing-song tone to her voice cut into Scott. All of this was wrong, but at the same time, he knew nothing would stop her or prevent her from killing more, and she already had 4 dead bodies to her name. Carolyn continued.
I told him the same thing as I killed him. Lay back and enjoy it. I don't think he believed me. Oh well.
She shrugged, turning back to the table.
You can't kill people. It's illegal,
Evelyn said, as they kept walking up closer to the girl. Now Scott could see her eyes were blue and her teeth slightly crooked.
Well, you also can't rape people. Funny that. Apparently they could.
She started laughing, though it sounded more like a cackle.
Now no one else has to worry. They won't understand the meaning of no.
She spun in a circle, her bare feet turning black with the ashes as the table continued to burn. Evelyn closed her eyes.
Carolyn.
Her voice rang through the clearing, and there was something heartbreaking about the emptiness of her tone. The woman stopped to look at her.
Yes?
Her voice held a childlike intensity that made Scott flinch internally.
I am so very sorry,
Evelyn said in a voice laden with so much emotion, Scott almost turned to look at her, but he kept his eyes on the target, 9mm drawn and ready to be brought up in a second. Carolyn looked at her and then smiled slowly.
Me too.
and the next second, she collapsed to the ground. Evelyn walked over to her, not running, but not a casual stroll either, and crouched next to her.
I'm sorry.
She whispered one more time. Scott followed her and gazed down at the body of Carolyn, staring up at them, life fading from her eyes. Evelyn smoothed the eyelids over those blue eyes, head bowed before the tragic figure of a girl.
Remember when I said I never had a takedown I'd lost sleep over?
She asked in a bleak voice. Yes, Scott replied, just as somber.
I do now.
Chapter 13. Home again. They stayed there with the body until the coroner showed up. Then Evelyn walked away. Scott watched her go, wondering if he was supposed to do something. Standing there alone in the park with 2 dead bodies, he finally gave in and called Billy. Go, Billy said, when the call connected. We executed the warrant. Evelyn left, Scott said, watching the blue sky. It seemed wrong. There should be clouds and thunder and pouring rain, not the endless blue sky of Southern California. So much tragedy shouldn't happen on a beautiful day. Billy's voice dropped. She sent me a message. You have downtime for the next week. She said come back on Tuesday. Today was Wednesday. That meant she was closing their territory for a week. She can do that? Close for that long, I mean? Yep, it's her territory. There are technically quotas and stuff, but that only ever comes up if there are warrants in your area that you're ignoring. She doesn't. Besides, it isn't like we don't go months without a warrant popping up. Go home. Enjoy the break. Just keep your phone with you. Any issue if I go up north? I've got family in Sacramento. Scott thought how fun surprising his family would be. Even with the government-sponsored college degree, traveling back up to see family when he was in UCLA had been difficult. No issue. That's a great idea. Get your head on straight. Worst case, there's a military base near there. We'll pull them in to get you back if needed. Besides, you'll need to meet with the shrink when you get back. Scott looked at where Evelyn disappeared from. The takedown disturbed him. Such an odd word to cover the death of a young woman. But Evelyn's reaction worried him. Is there anything I need to do about Evelyn? Nah, leave Evie be. I knew this one was bad, but she dealt with it. The takedown has been reported. I couldn't pretend to not see that warrant, though I knew it would be hard. And if that woman was spiraling, it would only get worse. His voice conveyed some knowledge that Scott didn't have and wasn't sure he wanted. Scott nodded, though his psyche felt soiled somehow. Maybe her meeting with the shrink would help her find peace. He knew he needed it. Okay, headed home. He called a taxi, paying for it with the government card. An hour later, he was walking in the house after being dropped off at the office. He'd showered and stowed all his equipment there. The parking lot was quiet as he climbed the stairs to his place. He opened the door and noted another envelope shoved under the door. That caused a memory, and he looked around for the other one that had shown up a while ago. He'd forgotten about it. Still holding the new one in his hand, he finally found the first one under a bunch of mail he needed to go through. Mostly junk mail, but he wanted to double check before he trashed it. He pulled it open again and frowned. He put it out of his mind. Still confused about who could have sent it, he opened up the new envelope and pulled out a sheet of paper. Someday you'll lose everything. They all will. Everything that matters. Someday you'll understand my pain. On that day, the balance will be paid. Written in the same block print, no signature. This one he wouldn't forget. He put both letters down and found a larger manila envelope to keep them in. When he went back to work, he'd show them to Billy and Evelyn. The Hunter role paid well, so he called and got a flight for the next day from LAX to Sacramento and arranged a car. By the time that was done, and he had packed for a week, it was dinner time. He found a TV dinner in his freezer and settled down to read and eat. But the warrant today kept poking at him. It felt wrong, but he didn't know of anything he could do. When the last of his chicken fried steak was gone, he found a notebook and a pen and jotted stuff down. Maybe talking to his dad might help. Michael Randolph loved to study history and philosophy. He'd worked for Pac-Bell until they merged and took an early retirement. He'd used that windfall as a chance to follow his passion for philosophy and to become well-read. When Scott was a kid, his dad's philosophical questions at the dinner table drove him and Emily crazy, especially when they had friends over. As an adult, the questions were a lot more laden with possible missteps, but it meant his dad would understand his trepidation. With the flight arranged and packing done, Scott settled in, ready to see his parents in the morning. The flight left at 6 a.m., meaning Scott was there at 5, yawning and snoozed most of the flight up. though it wasn't enough sleep to make up for the tossing and turning of the night before. If all warrants were like this, he might not be able to handle this job. That worry lingered in the back of his mind during the drive to his parents' place. Pulling up, he saw his mom's Mazda Miata and Dad's Jeep were both there. Fighting a grin, he grabbed his bag and walked up, ringing the doorbell. A minute later, his mother pulled it open, stared at him, then a huge grin split her face, and she had her arms wrapped around him in a tight hug. Donna Randolph had little patience for anyone's bullshit, and it showed in her dress and attitude. She had sandy blonde hair that curled every which way no matter what she did, so she kept it short, making the curls look tousled all the time. Wearing jeans and a t-shirt, no makeup, and only her wedding ring for jewelry, she looked much younger than her 54 years. She still worked as a medical transcriber, and they used her money to take trips all over the world.
Scott,
She exclaimed as she stepped forward, wrapping him in a hug.
what are you doing here? Not that I'm complaining.
She said as she let go and stepped back, allowing him to enter. Unexpected downtime. I thought I'd come home. Her smile revealed teeth stained by years of smoking and coffee, though she'd managed to quit smoking in the 80s.
Come on, your dad is in his office. He's going to be delighted. I am, however, dumping him on you. I've got at least 2 more hours of transcribing to do before I finish up today.
He nodded, the answer not a surprise. She headed down the hall toward his dad's office. When he and Emily had moved out, they'd converted the bedrooms to their offices. Though Donna's resembled an office with a desk, typewriter, her transcription stuff. She had bookcases full of medical terms, a small TV, and her coffee pot. Scott got his coffee drinking from her. Last he talked to her, she'd mentioned she might get a computer, and that would increase her transcription volume, though he didn't think they'd gotten it yet. His dad's office, on the other hand, was more of a retreat from the world. Lots of philosophy, ancient history, and fishing books. His dad would go fly fishing occasionally, and even bring trout home. He said it was the perfect activity for a philosopher. Donna said it was the perfect activity for someone who just wanted a day off, but she smiled as she said it.
Hey, hun, we've got company,
She said from the door of his dad's room. Michael looked up with a,
Huh?
a smile broke across his face.
Scott! How great! Come in!
Donna waved at them with a flick of her hand and headed back to her work.
What brings you here?
His brows furrowed as he inspected his son.
Everything okay?
Scott sank onto the chair in a corner, nestled between 2 bookcases. His mouth opened and nothing came out.
Obviously not. Though I am glad you came. Talk. Then I'll talk.
We had a takedown yesterday. My first. It was bad. He didn't know how to explain everything, so it all came tumbling out. His dad listened, which was why he came home. He knew there'd be a shrink appointment, but he needed to talk to his dad first. Then the mall incident tumbled out after. He didn't know how long he'd been talking, but at some point, Michael had poured them both some whiskey, and the light had changed from hard and bright to soft and orange.
You've had a busy few months,
Michael said with a smile, holding his tumbler.
What are you looking for? Absolution?
Scott laughed, or at least he thought it was a laugh. I don't know. Maybe? Maybe reassurance that this is the right thing to do? Michael leaned back, staring at the ceiling.
Nietzsche talked about the abyss. Descartes about the soul of man. But I think you're trying to make sure you're not taking actions that you'll be ashamed of at some point.
Or that they were the wrong things to do? Scott didn't know when he turned back into a teenager, aching for his dad's approval. But there it was.
Do you regret the actions you took at the mall?
Scott sipped the whiskey, concentrating on the burn for a moment.
No.
That's what I'm struggling with the most. I killed someone, permanently damaged others, and all I can feel is a sense of relief that I stopped them fast enough.
Then those actions you are fine with. Let it go. What about the girl?
Scott wanted to point out she was a woman, not much younger than him, but something about the entire situation made her come across as younger, violated. I know she killed 4 people, but I doubt she'd ever kill anyone else. Those 4 hurt her in ways no one should be hurt. But the madness in her eyes, the pain, made him doubt those words.
Does that excuse what she did?
Scott sighed, staring at his hands. No. And for any of those crimes, the penalty was death, regardless.
Did you hate her? Did your partner?
Scott's head jerked up, and he stared at his dad. No. If anything, I'd say we both felt sorry for her, that anyone would be in that situation.
Then it is done. Mourn for what she lost prior to her choices. You will have to become more phlegmatic if you want to survive this job.
He never asked his parents their thoughts about it, and the question burst forth. Do you think I made the wrong choice taking this job? This time, Michael sipped his whiskey thoughtfully.
I think it is a horrible thing that the job exists. But even I can see the writing on the wall. If those that are willing to kill rampage through our society, we would be back to despots, tyrants, where might made right. I think that if we have to treat other humans like this, I'd rather someone like you do the job, rather than one who revels in the pain or enjoyment of death.
Scott noted his dad didn't answer the question, but it was enough. I can see that. So, what did you want to talk about? Michael sighed and handed him a little cassette tape. It was one of the ones that answering machines used to record messages.
We've been getting threats. The first one I dismissed as teenagers being stupid and erased the recording. But there are two more. I've been trying to figure out what to do with them, and maybe you know.
Scott turned the cassette over in his hand. What did they say? Michael didn't look at him.
Stupid things that sound like they belong in a B-movie. But when you get home, listen to them. Maybe they aren't as innocuous as I think.
Dread settled into Scott's stomach, but he placed the tapes with his belongings and pushed it out of his mind for the next few days. Now was the time to enjoy being with his parents. Chapter 14. Wolf? The time at his parents sped by too fast. The tape sat in his carry-on teasing him, but Scott resisted listening at his parents' house. He bought a mini cassette player on the way home from the airport. The dread pounded in his veins as he hit play. The first message was a note from Donna's employers about a new set of files on their way. The second started with a strange noise and the sound of vehicles. Then, a male voice.
You didn't lose anyone. I did. Someday, you'll be the ones in the ground, and they'll know what loss feels like.
Then it hung up. Scott swallowed and kept listening.
You need to tell them. Make sure they know to start mourning you now. I wish I'd known how much it would hurt. That I'd cherished every moment. You never understand until they are gone.
Scott couldn't swear, but it sounded like the same voice. He sat alone in his apartment, the suitcase next to his leg. The envelope with the letters in them sat near the door. Technically, he wasn't due back until tomorrow. Scott gave in and pulled out his phone, clicking on Wolf. 2 rings later, it picked up.
What's up, Scotty boy?
Billy's irreverent response had Scott rolling his eyes, but he pushed it away as inconsequential. Billy, any chance you're in the office?
Yep. Took the downtime to upgrade some stuff. They've got some new vid cards that are like insane. Luckily, I've got a budget to spend.
Before Billy could get too far in the glories of the new cards, Scott cut him off. I'm coming in. I've got something to show you.
Your time off, man. Do what you will.
While the words were dismissive, the tone was sharp with interest. See you in a few. Scott drove to the office, resisting turning on the lights in his 300ZX, but the rapidity at which traffic was flowing provided some relief. It might all be a silly mix-up or coincidence, but if it wasn't, it could be the precursor to something deadly. His foot pressed down on the gas harder. 15 minutes later, he walked in the door, feeling odd as he bypassed the locker room and his normal routine. He knocked on the War Games door, and it clicked open.
Yo, what's up?
Billy spun to him, wearing a new graphic t-shirt. This time, Scott thought it was Buffy, but that wasn't important right now. About a month ago, I got home and found a threatening note under my door. It was right after I moved in, so I kind of forgot about it. After the takedown, I got home and found another. It reminded me of the first one, so I decided to bring them both in. With that said, he handed the envelope to Billy and swallowed.
Come on, don't keep me hanging. What's got you running in here?
Scott took a deep breath and let it out. Control was the important part. I went to see my parents, and my dad said they'd had some odd threatening messages left on their answering machine. He handed over the tape player to Billy as he spoke, having to resist the urge to pull it back, make the threats not real.
Huh. Okay. Let me check. Any thoughts, Evie?
Billy looked up and behind Scott. Startled, Scott turned to see Evelyn leaning on the doorframe.
Could be some of the normal jokers. Quite a few of us have stalkers, but bringing the parents into it is a new twist. Did you check with your sister?
She had dark smudges under her eyes, but that was the only evidence that she was anything other than her normal self.
No. Should I?
She gave him a long look that had Scott digging for his phone. He dialed Emily's number from memory. It was the middle of the day, but she usually had her phone with her, just in case the school called.
Hello?
Her voice answered with a weird catch in it. Emily? It's Scott. Is everything okay? As his older sister, Scott thought Emily was the best, but life had taken them in different directions. As the only mage in his family, Scott had finished college and ended up here. Emily married an idiot right out of high school, already pregnant, who dumped her and Megan years ago. Now she worked as a secretary at a law firm.
Oh, Scott, it's you.
The amount of relief in her voice set that hair on the back of his neck standing on end.
What's up?
I think I should be asking you that question. What's going on? Scott stared at the floor, unwilling to meet anyone else's gaze as he waited for Emily to respond.
You're going to think I'm being silly.
She said, her voice hesitant. I doubt it. You're one of the most unfunny people I know, he replied, trying to make her laugh.
Gee, thanks.
She responded, but her voice lightened.
Just some moron calling and telling me that when I'm gone, he'll know grief. It wasn't just the words, but how he said it, like he'd lost everything. I don't know what he meant though. Dad? Vince? You? Mr. Freeman?
Vince was her ex-husband, and Mr. Freeman her boss, but she was right. What he could the caller mean? What did Vince say? Scott shifted from foot to foot, the image of his sister in his mind. Her dirty blonde hair, the same as his, was usually permed and kept in a tousled tumble of curls that hid her shoulders. But he could hear the worry in her voice, and she had the most upbeat outlook of anyone he knew.
Just some idiot trying to get his thrills by scaring me. That I shouldn't answer if I don't know the number.
The amount of exasperation in her voice matched how she usually talked about Vince. He hadn't been worth much as a husband. But you answered this phone, he pointed out, unsure why she had.
Meh. I was going to yell at him if he called again. But why are you calling me from this phone number?
Interest fled back into her voice. My new work mobile. Add it to your contacts. He glanced up at Billy and Evelyn, unsure what he should say now. Billy's rapid typing on the keyboard echoed in the room. A moment later, a text document appeared on his screen. Ask her if she knows what number he called from. Scott nodded and continued talking to his sister. But this guy doesn't sound good. Maybe I can ask the people here to look into it? Do you know what number he called from? Emily had known about the job change, and she thought it was scary, but neat. His niece, Megan, thought it was the next best thing to having her uncle be James Bond.
Give me a second to pull it up.
Her voice got tinny as she put him on speaker.
Okay, I've got 2 different ones.
She provided 2 different numbers, one in the 805 and the other in 909 area code. I got them. I'll see if the people here can do anything. Just if anything happens, call me, okay? His voice dropped. The last thing he wanted was to lose his sister.
Scott, you can't fly up here to unclog my toilet.
She said, the smile evident in her voice.
I'll be fine.
Promise me, and be careful. Even weirdos can be dangerous, he said, trying to keep his voice light.
I promise. Talk to you later.
She hung up, and Scott looked at Billy, who had been typing like a speed demon since she provided the numbers. They're both payphones. Not much to go on, but I've got the addresses. I'll see what I can find. Thanks. Anything I can do? The idea someone was threatening his family didn't sit well with him.
Sure,
Evelyn said.
come spar. I need a punching bag, and since you're here, we can work on that.
Her smile was dark, with gleeful eyes. He hid a groan and reminded himself to get more painkillers. Today was going to hurt, but at least someone was looking into what was going on. Hopefully, it will prove to be nothing. Chapter 15. Stakeout. Scott settled back into the routine, but followed Billy's lead and didn't ask Evelyn about the girl or her reaction to the takedown. She acted normal, if angrier than usual. Nothing else happened, though Scott took to calling his parents and Emily daily, but they were all fine and found his concern touching, though annoying. Evelyn said nothing either way, so Scott focused on preparation. Heads up, we have an execute warrant for an escaped drug dealer, Billy said over the speaker. Evelyn stopped mid-strike. They were in the middle of sparring, drenched with sweat, and would have finished in another 10 minutes. At just past 10 in the morning, they were both sweating and breathing heavy. Evelyn hit the intercom button on the wall.
Be there in 5.
They raced to the locker rooms, only letting water rinse them off before they both hit their lockers and were pulling on their pants and shirts and getting geared up. Full load? Scott asked as he reached for his belt.
Yes. Though you're doing the takedown if we can verify the identity of the perp. I'm not taking the chance it's a mistaken ID. There are days I wish I had soul so I could KO people. It's much easier.
She finished pulling clothes on and slipped her 9mm into the waist holster. Got it. Scott grabbed his and slipped it in the holster. He finished zipping up his boots. They were both out and headed to Billy's domain in under 5 minutes. The door was open, waiting for them. Name, Tyrone Henson, a.k.a. Double Tap. Convicted of 3 deaths, 25 charges of selling tainted drugs linked to 5 for deaths, 5 counts of manslaughter, and a laundry list of misdemeanors, including dodging the draft requirement. He'd been convicted and was being transferred for sentence fulfillment when he escaped. Took out 2 guards. They're in the hospital. He's headed toward his old territory. Here's the information you'll need. Billy shoved a small stack of paper at them.
I'll drive. You navigate and read.
Evelyn ordered as she leaned forward to peer at the computers, though she still didn't step all the way into the office. No chopper? Scott asked, flicking a glance at her.
We aren't sure where we are going, but we may need to be mobile, so no chopper. Besides, driving is faster to this location.
She was studying the MapQuest map on Billy's screen.
Is anyone else looking for him?
No. There is an APB out, but he's a mage, even though we don't know his rank. The guess is at least a wizard level.
Billy had blown up the map on the screen, making it easier to see from the door. Evelyn nodded and spun on a heel.
Let's go. The faster we are there, the faster we either execute a warrant or we act as backup.
She hit the door by the time the last words were out of her mouth.
And I'm taking my car. It's faster.
Scott swallowed, trying to tell himself it would be fine. Maybe if he focused on the paper, and not the scenery, it would be easier. She slid into her car like they had made it for her. He fell into it, fumbling with the seatbelt. The door had barely closed before she was driving out at a rate of speed that would have been wonderful on her chopper. In a car, Scott had to focus not to whimper.
Suck it up. What about the car and her driving freaks you out?
He had no clue.
1 mile, turn left onto the 4-lane road. Then 5 miles on that until we reach the interstate. Go under the overpass and turn right.
He kept his attention on the paper. 10 minutes later, he lifted his head.
We need to slow down. The location provided is in the middle of a residential area, and this car is obvious.
Exactly,
She replied with a grin.
It should grab someone's attention. I doubt this double tap is that intelligent. Remember to verify the ID first, though. I have no desire for that paperwork nightmare.
She flipped off the flashing lights as they approached the last street.
Last known address is on the right. Gray house.
Scott pulled out the multiple mugshots of the perp and placed them in easy reach.
Now, we wait.
She sank back into the seat.
You're up first. Keep your eyes peeled.
Evelyn hummed for a moment, then smirked. Scott only saw the smirk because he was watching her, confused.
Not to be a nosy newbie, but isn't this car obvious? I mean, getting attention while driving is one thing, while sitting here is something else.
Evelyn snorted.
Nosy newbie? Really? That's how you describe yourself?
Scott rubbed his face and ignored the comment.
The car? I mean, it's an amazing car.
He patted the dashboard. But inconspicuous it isn't. Her eyes were still closed, and she shook her head.
Think. We're mages, remember?
And? Nothing came to his mind. Her Viper was a fancy red sports car. People, especially gang members, would notice it.
Air mage, illusion. Now it looks like a beater that might make it another 10 miles. It's a standard one I use. Unless someone tries to sit on it or jack it, the illusion will hold.
Oh,
Scott groaned in his mind.
you've got to start thinking, or he might get both of you killed. Or worse.
The vicious thought hung in his mind as he settled in to watch the house and surrounding area. It took a grand total of 20 minutes before he was bored to tears.
How do you not go crazy doing this?
Hush, I'm sleeping,
she said, her eyes not even flickering.
If I do that, it means we aren't watching. I should have brought a book.
The last was meant more as a mutter to himself. At least then he'd have something to do. If they had to do this too often, he was going to buy some audiobooks and a portable CD player. That at least would give him something else to pay attention to.
Reading is too distracting. There's a blank notebook and a pen in the glove box. Doodle or something.
Scott opened the glove box and pulled out a yellow notepad and a pen. He settled down, trying to think of something, letting his mind drift as he watched the house. The minutes ticked by into hours, and he was pretty sure he'd go insane. Trying to do this solo was the most boring thing in the world. A puzzle book was getting added to his locker, just for scenarios like this. At least Sudoku would occupy his mind. Just when he thought he might risk his life by pestering Evelyn, someone walked out of the house. A young man, white shirt, do-rag around his head, looked up and down the street. From the distance, he looked about 17 and Hispanic, but that could change as they got closer. He needed binoculars. Add that to the list too. Make a bag for stakeouts. The thought distracted him as he figured out what else to put in his bag, but his eyes never left the young man, who settled down on the porch. Obviously, the teenager was playing lookout, but for what or who? Every so often, it looked like he called back into the house, but they were parked too far away to hear. Moron. Evelyn, can you pull the sound over here? They're talking. She cracked open an eye, then shut it, and sound swirled inside the car.
See anything?
No. 2 cars drove by. Both too nice for police. Everything else on the street is empty or normal.
Keep watching.
The man settled down, flipping a knife back and forth in his hand. The sound of a TV playing inside the house drifted back and forth. Scott waited as Evelyn yawned and sat up. She turned around and dug behind the seat. Her car, the Dodge Viper, didn't have any back seat, but there was space. A teeny amount of space. She pulled out 2 bottles of water and handed one to him. Thirst Scott hadn't realized was there slammed into him, and he cracked open the top, sipping. Warm, it still tasted wonderful. Sounds like they were waiting for him to show up. Do we need to worry about the back? He asked.
Maybe. But look at the houses. They all have high walls. Having him come in the front is just easier. We'll know he's here if they suddenly go back inside. Let's see what happens first.
She sat up and watched as the person on the steps just stared out at nothing.
Still clear?
Someone from the house called out.
Yeah. Only the mail has come by in the last hour or so.
The knife-flipping man just kept scanning the street, not moving from his position on the steps.
Okay.
Was the response. To be honest, Scott wasn't sure who was saying what, but it gave them some idea.
5 minutes. Be ready.
The young man stood and pulled a pistol from the small of his back. From here, it looked like a 9mm, but Scott wasn't swearing on anything. He glanced at Evelyn. She leaned forward, her focus on the people in the small house. He didn't need to say anything else. They waited. The distant sound of traffic and the still new car smell, the only accompaniment to their focus. After what Scott privately thought was an eternity, a bland, blue Toyota Corolla came driving up the street. It slowed outside the house. The back door popped open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with scraggly dreads, a baseball cap, and a dirty t-shirt. I need him to turn, Scott muttered, holding the picture up. He compared the mugshot to the man walking up the drive. Both the image and the man walking had the tattoo of a cluster of grapes in red on the side of their neck, but that didn't prove anything. They needed him to turn around. Evelyn, can you do the reverse of the air trick? Send our voice over there? Scott asked. As seconds ticked away, the man opened the gate, walking into the front yard.
Good idea. Get ready,
she ordered as she watched the man.
Hey, Tyrone.
The words didn't sound next to Scott's ear, but the man froze mid-step and whirled around as if looking for someone. He'd shaved the beard that was in the photo, but the teardrop tattoo, the scar across his face, heavy-set brows, and pierced lip all matched. Verified, Scott said.
Take him down,
Evelyn said coolly, but she didn't take her eyes off the perp. This was the last test, Scott realized, and he only had seconds. He took a deep breath. Chapter 16. Executed. He focused on the man standing about 100 yards away and reached with his magic, weighing the offering. His life wasn't on the line. No terror, no desperate desire to survive. But now his job was to kill this person. Could he do it? Did he want to be able to kill people so easily? Maybe I'm the sociopath? For a second, he hesitated. Then he surrendered the offering to magic. It accepted his offering, and with that bit of effort, he pulled all the water out of Tyrone's brain. There was no gasp, no scream of pain. The man just crumpled to the ground with an odd grunt. In direct reaction to Tyrone's collapse, the man on the steps started to yell, and people came scurrying out of the house like a skittering of cockroaches.
Now we need to claim the body. Come on, move. If they move him, we're talking extra paperwork.
Evelyn was already getting out of the car. Scott followed in a hurry as she walked around the front of the Viper. We're walking up to a gang house where we just executed their leader? The words came out rushed, but Scott patted himself on the back mentally for his voice not squeaking.
Yes. It's hard to stand watch over a body from the other side of the street. We are required to claim the body and turn it over to the proper authorities. Why do you think you have a gun? Remember, they attack you, and they fall under interfering with an officer of the law, and we have the power and the right to use lethal force. Just use your gun. That's easier to justify.
She kept walking, her hand on the butt of the pistol, sitting in an already unfastened holster. What the fuck? One of the people tearing out of the house was yelling. More people headed to the gate. Tyrone! The young man on the steps had jumped up and rushed to the gate, clearing it faster than they could get across the street.
No!
That came from a woman who was racing out of the gate to the fallen man as Evelyn walked across the 2-lane road. She's either insane or has a steel spine, or both.
My baby!
The woman wailed as Evelyn reached them. Scott watched her back straighten, and a cloak of command dropped over her.
Stand back. We are hunters, and this has been a fulfilled execute warrant.
Her tone was almost formal as the language. Scott knew nothing in the training covered these words, just that they were required to retrieve the body, if possible. The courts frowned hard when the bodies just disappeared. You! Someone shouted. Everyone's attention snapped to Evelyn and Scott. How they had missed them crossing the street, he had no idea. Maybe she'd been hiding them with an illusion the entire time? Scott didn't know, but he drew his gun in response to having 6 guns drawn on them.
You killed my baby boy. You're a murderer.
The woman cried out, who was kneeling next to Tyrone. She tried to pull him up into her lap as she sobbed.
No, we fulfilled an execute warrant. He is the one who murdered people. You may stay with him until the coroner arrives.
She pulled out her phone, ignoring all of them to text someone. Scott assumed Billy. What's going to stop us from killing you? One of the others that showed up demanded. He was a large black man with the same grapes tattooed on his neck. Evelyn looked up at him, blinking. She didn't even put the phone away to pull her gun.
If one of you attacks, I have the legal right to kill you in defense of myself, and because you will be interfering in the duties of a sworn officer.
She smiled at him, and it was the same smile Scott imagined a lion would make before he ate you, all teeth and hunger.
But please try. I have 0 issues with a few less gangbangers in the world.
Someone else, a young Hispanic, too young to be seeing all this, muttered.
There's 7 of us. What's stopping us from killing you first?
Evelyn sighed.
Did that qualify as a threat? I think it qualified, but I won't kill you. It's too much paperwork.
She put her phone away as everyone with a gun shrieked in pain and threw their weapons to the ground. Several now had oozing wounds on their hands.
Ew, what the fuck, lady?
Someone screeched.
No, not what you wanted. I thought that transformation was pretty original. I mean, I could have made all your dicks into salamis. And here I thought transforming your weapons into rusted hunks of junk, coated with sulfuric acid instead was nice. But I mean, if you want to sit to pee for the rest of your lives, I can oblige.
She lifted a finger as if to cast magic, and they lifted their hands, backing away. At least most of them did. A few of them, especially the mother of Tyrone, still glared at them and looked like they were ready to launch themselves at the 2 agents.
You are getting perilously close to causing me more paperwork. I don't like paperwork. Scott, can you do that mouth disease trick? I'm tired of the licky-loos.
Evelyn's voice retained the same vaguely annoyed tone. Sure, he said, and everyone started gagging. The older woman sitting next to the dead man covered her mouth with her hand. Green goo welled up in the corner of her mouth, and she started gagging.
Please don't throw up on my evidence. It annoys the coroner.
By this point, the majority of the yard had cleared out, with most returning to the house. The woman rose and staggered a few feet away, repeatedly clearing her throat and spitting out the foaming bacteria and fungus. Scott's stomach roiled at that. The remaining people glared, their guns a pile of rusted metal, with a few shiny spots of blood.
Are we done, or will you do something as irrevocably stupid as he did?
She nodded at the corpse on the ground, no sympathy in her tone.
I'm fine removing a few more morons from the gene pool. Please, give me a reason.
Evelyn smiled again, and most of them backed up. That only left his mother still raging at them.
You killed my son,
She spat. The green moving slime that came out of her mouth tested Scott's control over his stomach. What was worse was the blue that oozed out of the corners of her mouth as she spoke, in between spits.
No, I executed your son after he killed 3 people directly, sold tainted drugs, and killed 5 more. One of them the ripe old age of 10. And when he escaped, he put 3 people in the hospital. Now tell me, how am I supposed to have any sympathy for him?
She stood there.
My son wouldn't do that.
Her bluster was good, as she kept glancing back at the man on the ground, gone beyond any hope of saving.
They had truth tellers in the courtroom. He admitted it. He was proud of it. Look at the pile of guns around you. Do you think good people carry that much hardware? You carry one,
She sneered, but the quaver of doubt was in her voice.
I am not a good person,
Evelyn replied, her voice hard.
but I work within the law.
The woman lost some color, blanching her skin from rich espresso to a faded nutmeg shade that didn't look good on her.
I'll press charges.
She blustered as a last stand.
Please do.
Evelyn said, and pulled out a business card, handing it to her.
All inquiries go through the U.S. Marshal's office first.
Then she just stood there and looked at the woman, an immovable object dressed in black and loaded with weapons. The woman took the card and turned to shuffle down the street. She must have been maybe 40, but right then, Scott would have added 2 decades to her age. We get cards? It wasn't the question Scott wanted to ask, but it was what came out.
Once you get your own territory, yes.
Evelyn said with a shrug. She stood, eyes scanning up and down, and Scott noticed a breeze swirling around them.
How are you doing? That was your first sanctioned warrant.
She didn't look at Scott as she spoke, instead doing the rapid scan. I'm fine, Scott answered. It disturbed him to realize he was fine. There was no guilt, no horror roiling through his mind, just the vague relief he'd finished the job. What did that say about him? What about you? Evelyn tossed him a look that he couldn't read.
It's a job, one I do well. My feelings are immaterial to this.
Scott turned his head to watch for any smart idiot that thought they could sneak up on him. What more could he say to that? It was a job, and it looked like he was rather good at it. It felt discomforting to know you were good at killing. The siren for the coroner heralded the arrival, and he let escape a sigh of relief. Even with the breeze Evelyn was creating around them, a good shooter could adjust for it. He'd like to get out of this temptation zone and back to the office, even if that meant more paperwork. They loaded up the body for the coroner. Evelyn had him sign as he was the one that pulled the trigger, so to speak. Then they headed back to the office with nothing to say. Scott couldn't figure out if it was because they worked well together or because Evelyn didn't have friends, just coworkers. Chapter 17. Head Shrink. The next day, he finalized on a few paperwork clarifications that were required. This was the on-the-job training for all the peculiarities required when executing a warrant. Evelyn showed him the primary ones, but the details he had to figure out on his own. That took an hour after Evelyn wiped the floor with him again, though at least she couldn't complain about his shooting score. He'd edged up to sniper, and she'd even given him a nod of approval.
Your shrink should be here shortly,
Evelyn said without looking up from her computer.
Name's Alexander Brendan.
Scott froze at the words. He'd honestly forgotten that aspect. The odd emotional ambivalence of having executed another warrant annoyed him. He needed a long talk with his dad about why this didn't bother him. Killing to save himself, he understood. This lack of angst, not so much. The shrink had declined to talk to him last time, only working with Evelyn, and she refused to say one word about the session. Ah, what is this person like? He asked, sitting there.
No clue. Mine has decided it is best she doesn't work with you. So, a new person is showing up. It was why she refused to see you last time, besides the fact that you weren't the primary executor.
Ah. Scott didn't know what else to say. He tried to lose himself in paperwork, but a ringing sound echoed through the speaker system.
Scott, your head dog is here.
Billy's voice came over the system immediately after.
Go let them in, so they can rummage about in your mind.
Scott sighed and got up.
Use Fielding's office. It's unlocked, and there isn't anything in there really besides our personnel folders. And frankly, you know what yours says, and if you peek at mine, you'll regret it for the rest of your existence.
Evelyn said, as she kept hunting and pecking at her keyboard. Yes, ma'am. But Scott laughed to himself as he got up and went to meet the person who was supposed to talk to him. He opened the door to a man a few years older than him, a spirit mage tattoo on his temple, dark shaggy hair, and a friendly smile. Hi, you must be Scott Randolph? He said with an engaging smile. Sure am. You are? The man slapped himself on the forehead. That's right. You haven't been studying my dossier for the last week. He fumbled for his wallet and brought out his driver's license. Dr. Alexander Brendan at your service. But for the love of magic, please call me Lex, not Alex. Scott tilted his head as he stepped back to let the man in. You'd rather be associated with Lex Luthor as opposed to Alexander the Great? The man stepped in and froze. I never thought of it that way. Mostly, my mother could make Alex sound like a curse word, and I wanted to distance myself. You realize you've made me question my entire existence? I thought I was supposed to do the head shrinkery, not you. Scott laughed as he ushered him down the hall to the office. Sorry. Father's an amateur philosopher, so I tend to think a lot. Huh. See, all the good stuff is never in the dossier. Lex stopped and looked at the office. Utilitarian. Ugh, I hate desks. Here. He wheeled the desk chair around to the front and pulled out the other chair, so they were facing each other. Which one makes you feel less like a child being called into the principal's office? Scott laughed. Power dynamic worries? I'll take the visitor's chair. That is solid enough I can sink down into it. With the other chair, I'll probably tilt backward. The desk chair in question was one of the leather executive ones that if you leaned back at all, you were in danger of flipping over. A solid club chair that didn't move sounded preferable. So noted. Risk of death if I lean back. I'll be careful. Or hilarious. You've got a 50-50 chance. Lex dropped his briefcase on the desk and settled into the chair. Let's get the formalities aside. I am a doctor of psychiatry, which means I can prescribe meds if I feel they are needed. I am paid by the U.S. Marshal Service via contract to work with hunters. With a few exceptions, everything you tell me is confidential. Scott settled down and waited for the rest of the spiel. If you talk about harming yourself or others, I will have you pulled immediately. If you talk about things that are regarded as treason, I will report you. If you talk about performing illegal acts since being assigned as a hunter, I will turn you in. He gave Scott a look with no humor. Do you understand what I have told you? Why the difference with the illegal acts? Scott asked, curious. It means if you tell me you killed someone before being a hunter, I can't act on it. Though most crimes tend to be shoplifting or maybe trespassing. I just don't want you to fear telling me about stupid childhood shit if it is affecting you now. Got it, Scott shrugged, the attention placing him under a spotlight. So now what? Lex smiled. Now, we talk, and I make sure your psyche can handle being asked to kill people. Scott narrowed his eyes. That is specifically something it is not called. Correct, but at the core of our being, our inner self, you know that while sanctioned and necessary, you still took the life of another human being. How does that make you feel? All the stuff he'd been pondering rushed back to him, and Scott leaned back. It doesn't. I mean, this makes the second person. The first was at Strathmore Mall, and I was about to get killed by him. Then I mostly felt relieved that I'd been faster. Now, with this last person, I don't feel anything. He'd killed multiple people, caused the deaths of others. He wasn't going to stop, and obviously had no remorse. So, nothing? He swallowed down the fear that this made him the monster. You feel in those cases the punishment of death was justified? Absolutely, Scott said with a nod. And the girl that Miss Crane executed prior to that? Ugh. The sound was a long sigh from Scott. I'm glad I wasn't the one. But? Lex prompted. What she had done couldn't be undone. And while I know the justice system failed her, and I can almost believe her rapist deserved her retribution, the defense attorney didn't. There was also the fact that I don't think she would have stopped. Her words. Scott trailed off, then shrugged. I'm not a psychologist, he said with a wave at Lex, but I think they broke her. If for some reason we wiped out everything she did and let her go, I suspect the first idiot to grope her or say something sexually explicit would die. Because she broke. I hate that the system failed her, but killing everyone involved doesn't make anything better. Do you feel that killing mages for these crimes is valid? Remember that most life in prison crimes for non-mages are execute crimes for mages. Lex had the same friendly look on his face the entire time, giving nothing away. I don't know, but that really isn't my place, Scott shrugged. Those are the rules that we as a society have agreed on, and I'm rather good at enforcing the consequences if you break those rules. And if the person really wasn't guilty? Lex kept up the prodding. There was something Scott had been wrestling with, but the answer sprung to his lips before his brain could process it. Then the courts have failed, and it goes back to them. We are not judges, nor the jury. Our job is to execute warrants that, if they have gone through the process, have been vetted 3 times. Any failure then lays at the feet of the judicial system, not us. Lex nodded. I'd say you're pretty stable. Any questions for me? Why don't I feel anything? I'm taking a human life, but it isn't bugging me. Doesn't that make me the monster? Lex said, leaning back in the chair a bit. I think it means you have a very compartmentalized way of looking at things. You have divided people into objects once they have been sentenced. You don't see them as a person, but as a chore to do. Scott winced, but couldn't deny the accuracy of that. That sounds like a monster to me. Do you hurt animals? Do you look at random people on the street thinking how to kill them? Do you care when people you love are hurting? The rapid-fire questions from Lex made Scott pull back and try to process it. No, I like animals. Zero desire to hurt them. I have no desire to kill anyone. And of course, I care. I worry about my sister and her asshole ex, and how my niece is dealing with school and the divorce. Scott almost felt offended, but he could see what Lex was getting at. Then you are fine. It just means there's a reason they picked you for this job. There are many people out there that can't separate what they do here as their assignment and their everyday life. You don't seem to have that issue. Seem? Scott asked, pushing a little. Lex grinned at him. I'm not reading your mind. I could. He tapped the tattoo on his temple. But you haven't lied, and I'm not reading you as a risk. Anything else? What now? Scott didn't know if he felt better, but something in him smoothed out. I check in with you in a week, and then we meet whenever you execute another warrant or you request it. Lex handed him a card. 24 hours a day, I'll answer. Otherwise, get back to work. Scott took the card with a laugh and stood. Sounds good to me. Thanks. He felt better as he escorted Lex out, but he still wanted some time to talk with his dad. Chapter 18. Nothing Amok.
Yo, got some news for you, Scott.
Billy said over the speaker system. Evelyn shot him a look from where she'd been at her own desk and got up as well.
Might as well see what he has. Could prove interesting,
she commented as she followed Scott into the hall. The door to Billy's room was already ajar, and Scott went in, Evelyn taking up her usual place by the door. You rang? Billy looked up at him with a smile.
Nah, if you're gonna use that, you have to do it in a low, deep voice. You rang?
He imitated from an old black and white show. Scott laughed and lifted his hands. Point. I'll remember next time. So, what's up? Another warrant?
Nothing so exciting.
His face took on a more serious mien.
And honestly, more worrisome.
Okay. That isn't what I was expecting. Scott grabbed the only other chair in the room, a simple waiting room chair, and sat down. Evelyn didn't move from the door. Billy turned to look at them.
How much did you follow what went down after Strathome?
Huh? That Scott didn't expect, and he had to reorient himself. 3 months ago stretched behind in a warped eternity in some ways. It also wasn't a time he liked to think about all that much. It cleared out of the news pretty fast. I know they found most of the participants guilty. They executed 3 of the idiots. But the others had hurt no one, so they were sentenced to double draft time. I think. He shrugged, as that had been all he'd seen. He'd also been too busy to search out the particulars. Billy blew out a breath.
Oof. That is accurate. 3 people died at the hospital after the scene was secure. 2 hostages and 1 of the mages. They'd run into a rebar while flailing around blind.
Scott winced. He'd willingly sucked the moisture out of their eyeballs and accepted it. But in his head, it was creepy that he'd blinded people. That part struck him as too much like torture now. But now I don't have an issue killing people? My morals are a bit distorted. Billy kept talking.
What's interesting is 3 of the hostages have gone off grid completely, and random reports are coming in about incidents. Weirdness encompassing both hostages and the terrorists.
What do you mean, incidents?
Evelyn asked. And how does it affect us? Her posture still screamed relaxed, but Scott knew she was tracking everything. Billy waved her off.
I'm not sure it affects you at all. Scott, though, might be a different story.
He typed and brought up 2 people on the screen, blurry mugshots.
Both of them are reported threats, but only a few. No written like yours.
He typed again.
Then you remember this guy, right?
A picture of the man who threatened the kids popped onto the screen. Scott repressed a deep shudder and nodded. Markswell, the leader of that group. The odds of him forgetting that man was low.
Yep, that's him. His family, who has completely disowned his actions, have received some voicemails and written threats. But again, only a few. Same with some of the hostages and their families. Vague threats, notes, similar to your notes.
He gave Scott a sharp look, then turned back to the screens.
But all of them have faded out in the last month. Other than some of the hostages being MIA, which is unusual in general for some of the populations. The worst has been swatting of some of the terrorists, and I can't get too upset about that.
I'm sorry, what swatting? Scott asked. He glanced at Evelyn, and she shrugged too.
It's when you call first responders, police, fire, and so on, giving an address saying something bad is going on, like Hunter backup bad. It causes a lot of fright and stress on the recipient when suddenly police or fire, or both, are pounding on their door.
Scott blinked. That doesn't sound good. Do you know who's doing it?
Not a clue. I'm working on it. Well, that could be anyone or multiple people. The problem is...
Billy trailed off and wouldn't look at either of them, instead staring at the computer screen. Is what? Evelyn prompted. Don't tell me you can't track this. She sounded oddly teasing and prodding at the same time.
Oh, I'm capable of it, but it is pushing a hard line on what I'm allowed to do.
Billy's voice was smaller than Scott had ever heard. Evelyn's face shuddered. Oh.
I don't understand. What do you mean allowed to do?
Scott looked at both of them, confused as to the issue.
Remember that misdemeanor that was dismissed about my hacking? Well, it is, but I'm still monitored. As long as I'm doing stuff that is within the mandate of the U.S. Marshals and the Hunters, I'm fine. This is pushing that line. There is no police case. No warrants have been issued. And there aren't any active threats. Even the stuff reported is pretty mild. The mall incident is considered closed, as they have sentenced all participants. It boils down to I'm not supposed to look at this.
He shrugged, moving the mouse around aimlessly.
If I keep digging, it will be for my own purposes, and people get grumpy about that.
Billy didn't look back at either of them. Scott nodded, trying to think. If I put in a police report, will that help? He'd not really felt scared, so until this point, it hadn't occurred to him.
Not really. Just one report isn't enough to reach the marshals. And again, there isn't a direct threat, just general ones.
Billy pulled up a website as he talked, the local police department. But he is under the umbrella of the marshals, Evelyn pointed out.
True, but the threats aren't direct, and could have been for anyone. If you'd been attacked, then I could act. But right now, there isn't much more I can do other than monitor.
Billy had shrunk down into his chair, looking smaller and younger than normal. Okay, let me get a report into Jack Fielding, our supervisor. That way, maybe we can monitor it. Scott fingered his phone as he stood, his mind on his family. Putting in a report wasn't a big deal, and this wasn't serious enough to have Billy risk anything. Scott needed to make sure he was the only one affected.
It's a good start, but just saying. I can monitor and see if anything else is reported, but I can't pursue this much further.
Billy's apologetic voice followed Scott out of the room. I get it. Rules and regulations. I'll file a report. Let me see what else I can do. He called back as he walked down the hall, the phone clutched in his hand as worry beat at him. Scott, where are you going? Evelyn asked when he didn't stop at their office area.
Stepping outside for a minute. I'll be back,
he called as he opened the outside door and stepped into his car. While he knew if Evelyn really wanted to eavesdrop, she could, and he didn't really have anything to hide. He just didn't want anyone watching him. He dialed the phone. Hey, Dad, how goes it? A smile sprang up as his dad chattered about the fishing trip in a few weeks, one Donna was going to go with. They had rented an RV and everything. They were both looking forward to quiet time in the mountains, and Scott knew his mom was stockpiling books to read. Now that I'm done nattering about my life, how about you? What prompts a call in the middle of a workday? His dad's calm voice was a balm to Scott's mind, even as the normal chatter had helped him calm down. Nothing could be that bad if his dad wanted to talk about vacations first.
Scott almost said nothing, but just in case something was going on, he asked, I wanted to see if you'd gotten any more messages or if anything else had happened. Have you talked to Emily?
No more messages here, though there have been at least 2 hangups when we answered the phone, but that isn't anything new. Emily? No. Last week she called muttering about child support and preteen girls, which Donna laughed about, but nothing else. Why?
The sharpness of his dad's tone meant he'd taken the question seriously. I don't know if this is linked to the messages you got or anything, but I got another message. It could be nothing, but just be aware, okay? There isn't a court case, so it's hard for my coworkers to track if this is affecting anyone else. If anything, and I mean anything weird comes up, let me know. It might give me the leverage I need to get more proactive. Scott forced himself to release the grip on his phone. His parents were his rock, and the idea of someone wanting to hurt them made his stomach clench and blood boil.
I will, but you realize this might all be something that will die down in time, or this is from someone who will never act. Lots of people vent their spleen anonymously.
I know, Dad, and that is the general vibe here at the office, but there is the chance of the opposite. I'd rather err on the side of caution and not rely on the theoretical goodness of people, especially when it comes to family. My family. Michael Randolph laughed.
Valid. We both know theory rarely equals reality.
Exactly. I'd like to know if something changes. My hope is this is nothing, and is going to disappear. But we both know people aren't logical and can prioritize short-term pleasure over long-term effects. Scott purposely played on the logic part, as it was a common rant of his father's.
That is true. Okay, I'll let you know. Promise.
Thanks, Dad. Scott hung up. He sat in his car, staring blankly at the exterior wall. After a minute, he nodded to himself and dialed Emily at work.
Preston and Wilkes Law Firm. This is Emily.
Her voice answered the call immediately. Emily, it's Scott. Have you had any more weirdness? Her professional voice had no stress in it, allowing his to die back.
Good morning. How are you? Oh, I'm fine. Yeah, Megan is fine too.
She replied, her customer service voice disappearing in favor of sisterly snark. Yes, Em. How are you? How's Megan? Has there been any more weirdness? He wanted to roll his eyes. She got stuck on the most unimportant stuff sometimes.
Men.
She mocked in response, then sighed.
Not really. A note on my car a week ago saying, enjoy having a child. But that was it. It didn't even sound like a threat. More like a lash of grief. But nah, nothing else has been going on.
Okay. I just wanted to double check. Just remember to call if anything comes up.
Yes, big brother. It's fine. I'm going to take a week off and stay at Mom and Dad's while they are on their trip. Megan's out of school that week for spring break, so it works well.
Her voice lilted upward, and she talked faster. Emily loved the house and missed living away from the hassle of the city. Sounds good. Just, I love you, you know? He said with a smile. Emily paused on the other end.
I love you too. Now some of us have to work. Get.
She promptly hung up on his laughter. Scott got out of his car and walked in as he dialed Jack Fielding. This he let Evelyn overhear as he filled their boss in on the issues and told himself they'd hear if anything else happened. Chapter 19. Freedom or MRR. The next month settled down into a simple pattern. Get to work, work out, train in magic, review bulletins and news, read up on laws and changes in magic, repeat. Only one execute warrant popped up. This involved an Archmage that had taken too many drugs and gone mad. He was raising up volcanoes from the earth and shattering people's bones for talking to him. That had been an odd one, but again, Scott didn't see anything else they could have done. There had been no more notes or weird calls. Scott talked to Lex about it, and they figured someone who suffered at the mall wrote them, but time healed all wounds, and they had moved on. If not, well, they would have to wait until something else happened. Scott stood in the practice room with the 12-inch Mage Hunter Joe doll, staring at it with his brows furrowed. It was a common toy, and he bought 6 of them to practice with.
What exactly are you trying to do?
Evelyn asked as she walked in, a piece of paper in her hand. She paused to stare at him, the same cool, assessing look she always had. I'm trying to figure out how to set up multiple time bubbles, all with different settings. If I could do that, I think I could contain a person, but still be able to interact with them. He blinked, rolling his head from side to side to try to break the tension up. Evelyn looked at him, peered at the doll, then back at him.
You're trying to put one foot in one time bubble and the other foot in a different one.
Yeah, set one to stop, the other to accelerate, but it keeps severing the feet off. He pointed to the 3 other dolls and various pieces behind him. But there should be a way to keep you at different points in time. Evelyn shuddered.
That sounds both horribly painful and almost cruel. I didn't think you had it in you.
Scott glared up at her from under his brows. Which is why I'm practicing on dolls. The last thing he had any desire to do was sever body parts, but it would be an interesting way to do it. She shivered even harder. Before she could say anything, Billy popped up over the speakers.
We've got a request for backup. Spontaneous protest turning into a riot at Regal 41.
On it. Did they have a spirit coming in?
Evelyn shouted as she headed to the lockers. There weren't microphones in the rooms, but the building wasn't that big, and if Billy's door was open, he'd hear her.
Yes, but it won't be another hour. They need a Merlin, and there aren't any, so they are trying to round up 2 Archmages strong in soul.
His voice crackled over the loudspeaker. Evelyn and Scott attached mace, batons, and their 9mm pistols. With luck, just the appearance of hunters would be enough of a deterrent to get people to disperse.
Your contact is any cop on the scene. They know you're coming in,
Billy said.
I don't have anything else to give you except directions.
Evelyn nodded.
I know where that movie theater is. We're taking the Crown Vic. If things go really bad, we might need the weapons in the trunk.
Scott nodded. He followed her to the car and slipped in as she dropped extra weapons in the trunk. A minute later, she peeled out and onto the main road. Quickly, before her driving forced him to shut his eyes, he texted Billy with their status.
We should be there in 3 minutes,
she said. With the lights and siren on, she wove around other cars like they were standing still. Scott added the time to the text, then put his phone away. He shifted his hand to get a grip on the handle and shut his eyes. Stress dropped at not seeing what she barely avoided. Thoughts?
Don't know enough to have any, but if they are still in separate groups, can you slap a bubble up over them?
She spoke as if she wasn't flying down a road at 90. Depends on the size. I've been practicing, but about 20 feet wide and 10 feet tall is my max. They were called bubbles, but it reacted more like carving out a square from reality. Or at least, none of his practice had ever showed rounded edges.
Okay. Odd that was all the information we had. Spontaneous protests don't usually go to riots.
She fell silent as she turned down the last street, and all the lights from the responders in the parking lot made the area look like a carnival. They slowed and parked, well down from the furthest police car, then hustled to the nearest cluster of officers. The 2 groups were outside the theater, and more people were arriving to watch. One of the officers, a man with a leaf on his lapel, turned to look at them. You the hunters? Evelyn nodded.
Yep. What's the story?
She waved at the 2 groups shouting at each other. Oddly, for a riot, most people were dressed in suits and dresses. No one had signs or t-shirts with writing on them. Some of the men had pulled off jackets, and at least one laying on the ground smoldering. The whole situation looked like a union meeting gone wrong. The man sighed. Captain Westbourne, glad you're here, I think. He looked exhausted and annoyed. The theater rents out the movie rooms to different groups in the mornings, for meetings, projects, whatever the space can be used for. The group pays, and they have the theater room to themselves, while they do whatever they want in the room. He had an exasperated tone as he talked with sharp, jerky gestures. The yelling was getting louder, and Scott could see the occasional flame spurt up, or ice, but he didn't hear screams of pain. Yet. Apparently, they had rented to both the Freedom from Magic chapter and Mage's Righteous Rulers group, and they got out at the same time. Instant chemical reaction. They're escalating rapidly. We've tried to get them to go home, but right now, there are 5 of me, and close to 100 of them. Emotions are winning over intelligence. He glared at the group. I hadn't even finished my donut when this stupidity started. Evelyn frowned as she looked at them.
They're too mixed up to use time bubbles to isolate them. Not to mention some of the mages might be more powerful than either of us. I can tear up the earth and create a barrier.
The captain winced at her offer. Let's not. The manager's already been over here talking about damage to the inside. If the parking lot started getting pulled up, the lawsuit would be against my department. We really don't need that, unless there's no other choice.
True. Scott, any suggestions?
Evelyn glanced toward Scott. Scott looked, thinking. We could give them a snowstorm. With my water and your air, no one is really dressed for freezing temperatures.
Good option,
Evelyn said after a minute.
But that might just rile up the mages, and it could escalate.
Scott winced as a burning shoe flew toward the Freedom of Magic people. Like it isn't already?
ETA on the Spirit Mage. Nona's crossed the line for us to really drop the hammer, but we can go over and act as the tough ones,
Evelyn suggested, but the grimace on her face said the prospect did not excite her.
Try it. You have jurisdiction if you need it. We can't react until there is the equivalent of attempted murder. And while I could start arresting people, that will make this even worse. And I don't want a full-out riot.
The captain sounded exhausted and more than a touch worried.
Got it. Come on, Scott. Let's go play big bad mage hunters,
Evelyn said, in a mockingly jovial voice. Scott just grimaced. The existence of the MRR as more than a fringe group worried him. He also knew they weren't the most rational group. He trailed a step behind Evelyn as they approached. She wasn't tall, but her aura grabbed attention as she walked up, and more people began turning toward her.
What is the issue here?
She asked in a loud, carrying voice, though Scott suspected she was using air to boost it. Cheater. He kept the thought to himself, but the internal humor lifted his mood a touch. See? They know you're a scum. They've even sent the hunters to take you out. About time, a voice called out. Evelyn's smile looked forced as she looked around.
The only good mage is a dead one,
someone else yelled out. Evelyn's head snapped in that direction, and Scott tried to figure out who in the crowd had yelled that, but the milling people and the low-level chatter made it impossible.
Right now, I'm not here to arrest anyone. What I'd like is for you to go home, so I can go home.
She let her voice carry again.
Why would we leave? You're a traitor to the tattoo, letting the sheep control you. Don't you have any pride?
This came from the MRR side. Scott heard Evelyn's teeth grind.
I'm here because this is an unpermitted protest, and you need to disperse. If everyone leaves now, no one gets hurt or arrested.
Her voice stayed calm, but Scott could hear the tension. He searched for a plausible course of action. A spirit mage would have made this much easier. Their ability to KO alone would have made it simple. The group started shouting, and Scott couldn't tell which side said what at this point. Screw you, bitch. We know our rights. Yeah, and we aren't letting these magic-loving assholes tell us how to live. Magic is an abomination. Oh yeah? I'll show you what an abomination looks like. With the last words, lightning started crackling in the air. Evelyn cursed, while others screamed and started heading for the theater doors, trying to get inside to avoid the lightning. The first strike of lightning hit the top of the doors with a shower of sparks, and that led to more screams. See? Mages should rule, not the sheep, a voice called, and Scott felt the earth move.
Fuck,
Evelyn hissed and shut her eyes.
I'll try to counteract the quakes. Having a building fall down would be bad.
She flinched as another bolt of lightning slammed into the sidewalk, and the rush to get away resulted in the shatter of glass. Scott lifted his head up to see the glass doors of the theater in pieces as people ran. To his frustration and horror, the looks on the mages' face as they watched people run shifted from anger to contempt to a type of malicious joy. Wonderful. How to create monsters in a day. Before he could react, a fireball and a massive lightning strike collided in a burst of sparks. Pieces of the building went flying as the flames took hold of the theater.
And now the freedom idiots are using magic too. What is it with me and fire?
Scott muttered. The magic flew fast and heavy at the fleeing Freedom from Magic group, with the occasional member forgetting their vows and striking back. It separated the two groups, but their members were scattered enough Scott couldn't slap a time bubble over them. He racked his brain. They needed to come up with more game plans for crowd situations.
Shit, the building is getting damaged.
Evelyn cussed as a sharp tremor jolted all of them, and the overhang of the theater cracked.
And I'm done with this bullshit.
She pulled out her gun and shot one of the mages flinging fireballs toward the theater. The crack of the gun and the scream of the person she hit created a sudden silence. She filled it with her voice.
The next person who casts magic will have a bullet put in their brain. I'll sign off on it, as in the defense of protecting others. Everyone, get down on the ground and lace your fingers behind your head.
The or else was very clear in her voice. Most did, some with expressions of worry and fear on their face, but 3 didn't get down. One of them, a man who oddly reminded Scott of Jughead, sneered at them.
Screw you! I've got a warrant now, so I'll be dead as soon as they run IDs. Might as well kill a hunter and a bunch of bigots while I can.
The layer of contempt in his voice made everything previous seem congenial. Chapter 20. Deja Vu. Shit, Scott cussed as a fireball came flying their way, and he and Evelyn dove in different directions. Why does everyone have fire, but we don't? Oddly, fighting fire with fire worked better than using air or water. Creating fire used less offering, and stayed around with minimal energy. He stood up from the dive and saw cops hiding behind their cars, the captain yelling on the radio.
Can you take him out, Scott?
Evelyn called.
The other one is trying to pull the theater down on Freedom Folk. It's taking all my concentration to stop that.
Yep. He paused, looking around. Actually, now I can take a bunch of them out, he said, as he took in the idiots. In what had to be an automatic human response, the majority of the MRR group had all drawn near each other. With a smirk, Scott slammed a stop time bubble up on that group, freezing them out of the time stream. The remaining mages outside the group squeaked and hunched in on themselves as they saw the rest of their friends frozen in the bubble. Finally, Scott muttered, as Evelyn shook herself, an offer vaporizing from her hair. Mob logic influenced way too many people.
Let's get them out of the theater. Captain, can your people watch these idiots? And someone get the EMTs to look at the one I shot,
Evelyn ordered, as she jogged toward the theater. Scott gingerly picked his way through the entrance, jagged glass and warping frames making it dangerous. He saw ambulances coming in as he made it past the entrance. People lay moaning on the ground, more than a few with deep lacerations, and the building trembled. If you can walk, get outside. We'll get help to anyone that is too injured, he ordered. No one moved. Now, he barked, pumping his annoyance and fear into his voice. This got people moving. Slowly, but they were moving. He headed to the cluster of people, all obviously wounded, some of them severely from the amount of blood splashed around. The ceiling creaked ominously. Earthquakes, lightning, and he was sure there'd been a mini twister chasing people in, if only for a moment. I've got to shore up this ceiling, he said, more to himself, as he verified there wasn't anyone in immediate danger of dying than anyone specific. Evelyn, can you come here? I've got an idea. His eyes flitted over the damage and what options they had. At this rate he was going, he needed to go back and take some engineering classes and structures. He kept ending up in buildings that were trying to collapse on him.
Yeah, what do you need?
She held herself super stiff as the noise of people whimpering and the smell of blood and ozone created mixed reactions. He moved over and grabbed one of the fallen doors, the press bar clinging to the frame. I'm going to put this against this pillar. It's starting to give. Can you merge the patterns and then transform the pillar to steel? He waited as she analyzed.
I can, but it's going to take a huge offering.
Evelyn stared at the ceiling as if mentally weighing the cost, then nodded.
But yeah, ready?
Scott held the doorframe against the pillar that had stress fractures running up and down it. He didn't let go until the heat from the frame got to be too much. By that point, the metal had woven into the pillar, and you could see it start to warp and twist. It got about half done, then stopped. Scott turned to Evelyn. Her hair was at her shoulders, and she was sweating.
If I lose too much more, I'll be at risk of not being able to work. Think that is good enough?
Scott rapped it, and it sounded solid. It should. We need time to get these people out of here, but that should do it. As he spoke, EMTs were running in with gurneys. By this point, there were news crews everywhere, and they were filming the time-stop mages, as well as the efforts to rescue the people in the theater. This is the last one, Scott called, as he helped get someone with the leg and crush injuries onto a gurney.
Good. I'm headed out,
Evelyn said, as she walked out with the second-to-last one. Scott waved at the EMT, who wheeled the woman out.
He took one last look around, hoping there was no one back further in the theater as the pillar groaned with a long, loud creaking sound. He turned and sprinted out with a crash and uproar of dust that came billowing out of the shattered doors. It slammed into a wall, then rolling, went straight up until it faded.
Scott looked at the remains of the theater. The paperwork is going to suck, isn't it?
Yep,
Evelyn said next to him.
But at least we weren't the ones that did it. These idiots are in for a world of hurt.
Speaking of which, you ready?
Yep.
The mages hadn't killed anyone yet, which means non-lethal measures, but there were still easy ways to deal with this. Or, kind of easy.
Evelyn grabbed 3 sets of cuffs from the cops before she headed over to just outside the time bubble.
With a nod to Evelyn, Scott got out his 9mm and stepped behind one of the 3, while Evelyn moved behind the erstwhile leader.
Take it down now,
she said. There was a weird shudder as the 3 men caught it to the current time. Before they could react, Evelyn spoke.
I've got a 9mm pointed at the back of your skull. My partner has another pointed at the other person's skull. If you cast so much as a whisper of magic, I'll put 2 in you before the offering is taken. Do you understand me?
Her voice was ice cold, and Scott could see the dawning danger in the Jughead look-alike.
Yes, ma'am,
they stuttered, almost in unison.
Good.
Evelyn holstered her gun, pulled out her knife, and grabbed the man's long tail at the base of his neck. In a smooth motion, she sliced it off. Scott could see the visceral reaction as she invalidated so much offering. The way magic worked is when you offered it, it had to be a part of you. Blood, hair, nails, skin cells, it still had to be connected to your body. If you cut it off, like hair or nails, it was useless. Though if you had a familiar, you could bypass that aspect. Familiars were relatively rare and operated by their own rules for the most part. She slapped cuffs on them, then proceeded to go around and neuter each of them magically before slapping cuffs on them. In reality, they could still do magic. Skin, blood, semen, even fingers. But the amount of available offering had been greatly reduced. Most people never learned how or were willing to offer anything else. Scott was learning other ways to offer, but usually the psychological shock of losing your hair was enough to cow them. Once they were booked, someone would shave their heads and cut all their nails. Still not impossible to do magic, just much more difficult. They delivered the 3 mages into the awaiting hands of the police, then headed over to the captain.
Sorry about that,
Scott said with a shrug.
Not your fault, but I can guarantee you a lawsuit toward the MRR is already being prepped, and possibly one against Freedom. But with them, you never know. Thanks for the assist, and nifty solution, what with the time bubble.
All him. Never worked with a strong time mage before. It's proving interesting. Need anything else from us?
Evelyn looked around her eyes lingering on the swarm of reporters just outside the line of cars, her eyes narrowing. The captain shook his head.
Nope, got your IDs. Just don't be surprised if you're called in to testify. I doubt there's any video of this.
Joy,
Evelyn muttered, but nodded at the captain and then headed to the car.
Remember, no comment.
She said the words out of the side of her mouth, and Scott stared at her.
Hunter Crane,
A voice yelled.
did you execute any warrants today?
A woman with a too-tight suit and impractical heels rushed toward them on the heel of that question.
No comment,
Evelyn snapped as she kept striding toward the car, making the reporters rush to keep up with her. Are there any body bags filled today? This voice was male, and Scott restrained a growl as he headed to the passenger side of the car.
Hey, you're Scott Randolph, the Hero of Strathome. You become a hunter?
Someone called out, and he could hear the murmur of reaction as it spread through the reporters.
No comment,
He said, pulling open the car door.
So, did you get anyone killed this time? Last time you had a death count.
The same voice called out. Are you sure you're not the reason they are dying? Scott spun, the blood draining from his face.
What did you say?
He faced the milling group of vultures.
Scott,
Evelyn hissed as she leaned over the seat.
no comment and get your ass in here.
A man with a garish t-shirt on, stating proudly that he worked for the magical tabloid news, held up a mini recorder. I mean, at least 2 wouldn't have been dead if you had done nothing. So, my question stands. How many people did your actions kill? Scott's heart pounded in his head, and he managed to mutter,
No comment.
before falling into the car seat and shutting the door. Evelyn had it gunned, and people scattered. She flew out of the parking lot before glancing over at him.
You okay?
Her voice was neutral. Is what he said true? She shrugged.
Maybe. But I can guarantee you the death count would have been much higher if you hadn't acted, and more kids would be dead.
Scott nodded, but he spent the ride and the rest of the night trying to figure out how he could have done something differently.
Chapter 21. Distractions.
After the incident at the theater, Scott found himself plastered across the news for a few days. Labels of hero and failure were both used, depending on the tone of the article. Some labeled what he had done then and the fact that he'd become a mage hunter as heroic. Others pointed out if he could do that now, why couldn't he have done that then? Maybe he only found it worth the time to spend offerings if he was getting paid for it. Evelyn told him to just ignore it, and he did for the most part. But all the attention left him on edge, and the familiar piece of paper under his door made all the puzzle pieces click into place as he walked into his apartment Friday night. The other shoe was falling, just like he'd expected. He bent over to pick it up, then shut and locked the door before he bothered to open it.
You could have saved him? This was your fault? Fine. If you can't stretch yourself to save strangers, I'll make sure you know exactly how much losing family hurts.
Again, there was the block print and nothing else. Scott sighed, wondering what this meant, besides the obvious. He called Billy.
Yo, what up?
Billy caroled into the phone.
You miss me so much already?
Scott just ignored the teasing. It was easier, and he didn't have the energy today to be able to interact correctly. I got another letter. This one is much more direct and threatening.
Ah,
The humor disappeared from Billy's voice.
well, read it to me. And next time, don't open this stupid thing. I can pull some favors and get a forensic department to look at it. But with your fingerprints everywhere, it's harder.
Scott snorted. You mean Mage CSI doesn't work as well as they say? A popular TV series. A set of mages, all passed their draft service, working as forensic techs and doctors to solve crimes. He'd been tempted to train for that career, but cutting into living creatures held no attraction for him.
Oh, they work. But until people start dropping like flies, or the dead bodies are found in horribly gory poses in public, they don't get called in.
Billy snarked back at him. That sounded all too realistic. Scott read the letter to Billy.
You're right. That does sound like an escalation. Mind showing these to Lex? He might have an insight and could let us know how seriously to take this. But I'll update your case with the marshals just so we have a trail. While I can't do any deep probes, I still have triggers out there if anything odd happens with any of the survivors, both hostage and terrorist.
Thanks. They talked for another minute before Scott hung up, but as always, they were at the point where there wasn't enough to really do anything about it, if there was something to do. But Billy's idea wasn't bad, and this whole thing was definitely affecting his own mental health. Maybe it was worth calling. Scott pulled out the copies of the other two letters. They sent the originals to the marshal's office. He laid out those and the new missive and sat down. He pulled out the card Lex had given him from his wallet. It was only 6 in the evening. Hopefully Lex didn't have some plans that he'd be disrupting.
This is Dr. Brendan.
Lex's voice came over the phone, sounding overly cheerful as usual. Lex, it's Scott. Do you have a few minutes? The idea of a whiskey sounded awesome, but it was his weekend to be on call. Not that he thought Evelyn would ever not respond to a call. It was better to stay sober.
Scott, saw you on the news, but it sounded like everyone lived. That is good, right?
Lex's voice had a jovial, teasing tone. That is good, but I wanted to talk to you about something else. Scott had almost forgotten about the theater, focused more on the letters. Go for it, Lex said, and he sounded more reserved. Scott explained about the letters, when they were delivered, and the word choice on each one. He copied down the text from the new letter on the copy of the old one, just to make sure he didn't get it mixed up.
Huh. And you've opened the case with the police?
Lex sounded thoughtful, though not overly concerned. Marshals, as I'm under their jurisdiction, but they all say there isn't anything to worry about now. The frustration leaked into his voice, and Scott took a deep breath to refocus himself. Lex's voice sounded thoughtful and disagreeing. What aren't you saying? Scott probed, worried about that considering hum. Why are people always so mysterious? Just say things.
Remember that I am not a behavioral analyst. I mostly focus my training on trauma, grief, and PTSD. That being said, there are a lot of overlaps between what I do and what an analyst would do.
Lex paused, and Scott could almost hear him gathering his thoughts. After a minute, Lex continued.
That first set sounded like someone venting, and the randomness of them pointed to a diminishing level of grief and anger. That's why I think everything trailed off. They were lashing out, and were doing it at anyone they could identify. I absolutely believe this related to the Strathome incident.
But, Scott coaxed, after Lex fell silent.
But I think something has happened, and the grief, rage, or whatever you want to call it, has been re-sparked, stoked even. And this time, I think it is all directed at you. But I can't swear to it. It might fade again, but it feels different this time. The anger comes across as more visceral.
Yeah, this letter does feel angrier than the others. So, what do I do? Scott didn't know if he felt better with this confirmation or worse. Lex laughed.
Not much. You've done what you can. I agree that the next letter you get needs to be untouched and turned over to a forensic tech. But at this point, there isn't much else you can do.
How worried should I be? That prompted a long silence, to the point Scott almost said something.
I would suggest wary, not worried. Watch behind you as you drive home. Vary your paths to and from work. Just monitor your environment.
That I can do. Okay. Thanks, Lex. That helps. Scott stared at the letters, but didn't see them.
Anytime. It's literally what I'm here for.
They talked another minute and hung up. Scott found himself sitting in his apartment with nothing to do. The newest books from the library didn't call to him. Drinking was off the table, and he had a weekend ahead. I need a life, he said out loud. No one responded to that comment. After standing and staring around the barren apartment, he growled and grabbed his keys, walking out the door. He stopped to stare at his 300ZX, but even that didn't look like anything he wanted to do. Instead, he just started walking. It took 15 minutes and multiple people giving him wide-eyed looks before he realized he hadn't changed clothes when he got home, which meant he stalked down the street in black BDUs, looking like what he was, a Mage Hunter. Ugh, he muttered. Today was becoming ridiculous, but the idea of turning around, going home, changing clothes, then coming back out sounded even worse. Up ahead, a store that advertised biker gear and t-shirts was open. He needed some more casual clothes. Why not? He approached the store, noting the motorcycle parked outside. It was an Indian chief with BAM stenciled on the side of the gas tank. Wonder what it feels like to have that much power between your legs. I'm kind of surprised Evelyn doesn't have one. Scott walked in, and every head in the store turned to look at him. 3 men, one behind the counter, one restocking boots, and a customer with a long braided beard and a chaos symbol on his temple. The restocker, a man in his early 30s, walked over. Hey, what you looking for? Scott opened his mouth, but the smell of leather and the bike that had been sitting outside changed his words. I was thinking of starting riding. Anything you can recommend? At this, the mage moved over, and from his stance, Scott suspected he was listening in. The back of his leather jacket had the letters BAM embroidered across the top. The bike must have belonged to him. Depends on the riding you want to do. We have some stuff for the rice burners, but most of what we carry tends toward a different crowd. The man watched him, not weary exactly, but more unsure of how to treat him. Rice burners? Scott had never heard that term before.
Crotch rockets,
the biker interjected, the sneer in his tone making it clear what he thought about them. Still don't know what you're talking about, Scott said. Being ignorant was much better than misinterpreting anything.
Zane, chill out,
the man behind the desk snapped. The biker shrugged, obviously not caring about chilling out.
I don't mind getting some more mages riding, but if they're going to ride, I'll give up booze before I let them get suckered into that high-speed Asian crap.
The image of the small, fast cycles he saw on the freeway flashed into his mind. Always brightly colored, usually with the person crouched on the back of them, in similar colors with the helmet that matched. Ah, crotch rocket. I can see that. No, I was thinking more about the cruising type, like what's outside, he said, nodding out to the front of the store.
See, Wyatt? You have to talk to get noticed in this world,
Zane said, moving over to Scott.
You decide to get a real bike? We meet and ride monthly. One of the larger mage groups in the area. You'll need to prove you can fit in. But,
he trailed off, smirking as he took in Scott's current attire. It was a long way from his preferred khakis and button-downs, though to be honest, those didn't fit as comfortably as they once did.
I think you'll be fine. You decide to ride with real mages? Look up badass mages. We're around. Tell them Zane sent you.
The man flipped a hand at the counter guy.
I'll be back. Still need a new helmet. One of the fancy ones. Let me know when my pants come in.
Will do. See you, Zane. Wyatt nodded at the man as he left the store. Scott arched a brow at the restocker. The man shrugged, but stayed silent until after the bell dinged, indicating Zane had left the store. We cater to a different crowd than the riders of Suzuki's or Yamahas, but if you're into the more traditional ones like Harleys, Chiefs, even some of the cruising Hondas, then you can get most supplies here. Scott looked around. The idea of getting his own bike, and maybe even some other mages to hang around with, growing in his mind. Right now, I want a t-shirt to wear out of the store. This is getting more attention than I'm comfortable with. He waved at his outfit. The restocker and Wyatt both snorted.
Can't imagine why anyone would be uncomfortable with a hunter walking down the street,
Wyatt called out. Scott stiffened.
Is it that obvious? Black BDUs, no badge? You're obviously in shape. You don't have a gun, and you're a mage. Pegs you as a hunter, an idiot, or a wannabe. The last two are the more dangerous, but you don't appear to be either of those, so I'll go with hunter. The fact that your belt has worn spots where there should be equipment on it kinda seals it.
Wyatt said all this with his arms crossed, watching him with a slight smile. Ah, Scott said, glancing down. Tell you what, find me a shirt and tell me about what bikes I should pick, and about this BAM group. Wyatt cracked a smile and talked while the restocker, Tim, got him a shirt. 2 hours later, Scott walked out, the store locking up behind him, the owner of a shirt with chaos symbols and the words, "Do you feel lucky?" underneath them. He also had the desire to spend the weekend motorcycle shopping. Chapter 22. Runners. After the weekend, and dithering over 2 bikes, Scott waited for the next few days for something else to happen. He even bought a box of latex gloves in case he got another envelope, but there was nothing. Thursday morning, they had just finished with their morning training. He'd managed to make Evelyn sweat that morning. Standing in the locker room, finishing drying off, Billy's voice crackled overhead.
Heads up, boys and girls. We've got a runner.
He dropped off the speaker, and Scott picked up his pace of pulling clothes on.
Huh. Been a while since we've had a runner. Odd.
Evelyn said, stepping up the pace as well. What's a runner? Scott pulled on the undershirt and was grabbing his tack shirt as he spoke. She didn't speak until she was down to just putting stuff on her belt.
A runner is when a mage is sentenced to labor to make up for their crimes because the judge has reason to believe they aren't dangerous. As far as I can tell, for a criminal, it's like winning the lottery. But if you flee your sentence, it's an automatic death sentence and a dark mark against the judge, which is odd. Most of them play it very safe when it comes to those criminals.
Scott filed that back in his brain. Every job had its jargon. This was just a new one to him. They headed to Billy's cave at a trot, Evelyn lurking by the door, while Scott moved up to see what was being displayed on the screens. What do we have?
This one is odd? No, that isn't the right word.
Too much coincidence? He shook his head again.
I don't know if there is a word for this.
Billy, Evelyn said, with a warning or exasperated tone to her voice. Scott hadn't been able to decide whether there was a difference between them yet.
Yeah, Billy said,
waving at her as if she was an annoying fly.
You'll see in a minute. Okay, these two, a husband and wife. They were part of the idiots that took over the mall incident you were involved in.
He nodded at Scott with a sideways tilt of the head. Scott frowned, the mention of the mall incident setting off warning bells. What about them?
They were deemed to be influenced by the ringleader, to where they couldn't have made an informed decision.
The way Billy pronounced the word deemed, Scott could almost hear his eye roll. Scott frowned, trying to figure out how they could have been influenced, and then he remembered. Oh yeah, the Merlin, Markswell, whatever. He had a spirit class, didn't he?
Yep, soul, which means he could have manipulated them more than we want to admit. As they both had jobs they didn't want to lose, plus a house and a teenager, the judge said they were guilty only of being stupid. My words, not his, and gave them the 5 years of community service. They are housebound except for work and their service. They can't even go to the store. They have it all delivered.
That sounds like a sweet deal, considering normally they would have received a death sentence and had it executed almost immediately after the trial. And only 5 years. That is extremely light,
Evelyn said, a frown on her face.
Yep, which is why this is so odd. But they both didn't show up at work yesterday or today. They found their ankle monitors cut off in their home, and their teenager has no idea where they are. Per the notes in the file, the kid is scared and confused. It says they left a note.
What? Scott exclaimed, moving even closer to the screens. Can you bring it up? The word note had created a knee-jerk effect in his mind. A rapid tapping of the keys and a few clicks of the mouse, and the note appeared on the side of the screens nearest to him. He peered at it, but it was written in a messy cursive and didn't resemble the notes he'd been getting at all.
Well, what does it say?
Evelyn demanded, but she didn't move from her position at the door. Scott cleared his throat and read aloud. Kimberly, I love you. I'm sorry. Everything is yours. You're 15. You got this. Know that we will always regret the choice to get involved with the MRR, but we will never regret protecting you. Love, Mom and Dad. He shook his head. From how it's written and signed, it looks like the woman Marjorie wrote it, and then she and Liam signed it. The dad's signature is in a different handwriting. It also wasn't a match for the letters he'd gotten.
That letter is odd,
Evelyn said, after a long minute.
Told you, Billy snapped. It's even odder that they were last tracked via credit card usage to an area near here. There's an APB out for them, but they are absolutely on the lam.
An APB, or All Points Bulletin, was common for anyone the police were looking for, but it didn't tell them where the fugitives were. So, any idea where we look? Billy had been typing like crazy most of the time they were talking.
I'm working on it, but they were in this area. Here.
A map appeared with a circle in the North Hollywood area.
What makes you think they're in that circle?
Evelyn didn't sound dismissive, just curious.
They're still using their credit cards, and I'm tracking the hits,
Billy responded with a distracted air as he continued to type. You can track it that fast? Scott asked, surprised.
Sure, newest tech. I'm linked with the banks. The warrant went through about an hour ago, and there's a trace on their cards. It's relatively new tech, but it's turning out to be extremely useful.
Then we're headed that direction. Call us when you get the next hit.
Evelyn straightened up as she spoke.
Will do. Here you go.
Billy turned and grabbed stuff off the printer and handed it to them.
You know, it'd be awfully nice if someday I could just send this to your phones.
What? You think we're going to be lugging computers around with us? I don't think so.
Evelyn scoffed.
Paper works just fine.
I'm just saying that someday there'll be a better way to do this,
Billy said, with a lip that trembled on the edge of pouting.
Sure. Don't hold your breath. We're out.
Evelyn headed out and down the hall before Scott had all the papers. With an exasperated sigh, Scott stacked them all quickly, then headed after her. She spoke as soon as he slid in and shut the door. They were taking the Crown Vic, which, while more subtle than her Viper, but it still shouted, "Cop" to the world.
It's better to drive this time, as they're moving. The chopper has limited mobility when we're in the inner city.
Yeah, I figured. Right now, we're headed...
Scott paused to check the map. Looks like we get on 101 for about 10 miles, then we'll get off. He checked the paper again, looking for more information.
Billy provided their mugshots and description, but how will we find them?
He should have an APB out, and cops will call back if they see them. Then we hope we are lucky.
She shrugged.
This honestly is rare. Most of the time, long-term hunts are what they do movies about, not reality.
Scott shot her a look, his confusion displayed too clearly. Then why are we even out here looking?
It's our job. Occasionally they are stupid and make it very clear where they are. But that is only the truly stupid idiots.
She grinned at him.
We are rarely that lucky.
The phone rang, the tone the one associated with Billy, Born to be Wild by Steppenwolf. Scott shook his head and answered it.
We have a report. They are destroying a baseball field in a park. Lots of pyrotechnics, wind, and scaring the locals.
The connection distorted his voice, but Scott could still hear the amusement in it.
They are what?
Evelyn said, glancing at Scott, her brows like angry furrows.
You heard me, Evie. Called in by cops staying a long way away.
Huh?
Evelyn murmured.
Which field?
Encino. Crespi baseball field.
Billy's voice, though staticky, was still easy to understand. Scott flipped open the LA area atlas on his lap to find it. Got it. 101 to White Oak.
Tell them we're coming, Billy.
Evelyn hit the lights and siren and stepped on it. Scott grabbed the handle and closed his eyes. This is unusual? He asked, though he didn't bother to open his eyes.
Very. I mean, if they want to die, why run? Why do any of this crap?
I don't know.
Neither do I, and I don't like it when there are changes in normal behavior,
she said darkly, and the car went even faster to Scott's discomfort. In an effort to distract himself, he asked, What would be the normal behavior? I mean, in this situation. A sharp swerve had his knuckles whitening as he held tighter.
They hit a few banks, take out as much cash as they can. If they've been planning to run, normally they've been selling things from their house, amassing more cash. Then they buy a car or do a trade and flee. They don't do this. It's like they're calling attention to themselves. That makes me wonder what else is going on.
Huh, Scott said, as his thoughts churned. It would make more sense. If they wanted to run, why make a spectacle of themselves?
Where now?
Evelyn asked, annoyance clear in her tone. Scott snapped his attention back to the map and gave the last directions. White Oak, then it should be on the right. There are multiple parking lots, and I'm not sure where they are in relation.
We'll park and hoof it toward them. Sounds like they're going to be hard to miss.
Evelyn was already turning and accelerating. Scott swallowed down the vague nausea. The woman drove like a maniac. 2 minutes later, the car slid to a stop in the parking lot. Getting out, Scott could hear the wind roaring like a train car barreling down on them. The rest of the air was still. I'd say they are in the vicinity.
You think?
Evelyn said in a sarcastic tone as she popped open the trunk. They grabbed the M16A2 from the back and started running toward the howling wind. Their garb and weapons had people backing away, which made it easier. It took them 5 minutes to get to the source of the wind, and when they got there, Scott gave a low whistle. They were in the baseball park, or what had been the baseball diamonds. The backstops were yanked out of the ground and twisted into a jumble of metal. Many twisters had scoured past into the field. The bleachers looked like a giant had smashed them, then turned them into crystals. though of what kind Scott had no idea. The two runners stood in the middle of the field, dressed in jeans and t-shirts. You could almost see their hair getting shorter, as they used magic with abandon. Evelyn pulled out the mugshots and verified their identities, though really, they didn't have any sort of disguise on. Over to one side, well back from the chaos, he could see multiple police cars and an ambulance. Scott glanced at the couple, confused. If they wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, why weren't they attacking the cops? They could easily have sent the Twisters there. They'd had the opportunity to make it appear to be a simple disappearance, but they had instead done a chase and left their home safe.
Let's see if they do it the easy way or the hard way,
Evelyn said with a sigh.
You take the male. I've got the female.
Scott snorted. I doubt we'll be that lucky. He raised his rifle up and aimed at the head of the man.
Mage Hunters, get down on your knees and surrender,
Evelyn boomed out, using air to make her voice sound like she shouted into a megaphone.